Chapter 100. Ning Ke pushed open the red door, lifted the bead curtain, and walked into the dimly lit quiet room. He drank 2 big bowls of fish-tail soup to sober him up, took a hot bath, and was heavily ravaged by the master chef on the bamboo bed where someone had died. The previous drunkenness had already faded by half, and he had become much more sober. Looking at the woman with a perfect figure hidden in cloth clothes, her broad and smooth forehead, and the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes, Ning Ke felt that it would be better if he were more drunk at this moment. He had vaguely guessed what he would face next. Although he always thought that the woman's strictness towards him was unreasonable, he had to admit that there was some care in her strictness. Therefore, he could not refuse and could only bear it with tears. "I haven't seen you for a while. I thought you had started to cultivate yourself after entering the academy and understood the importance of wanting to know and seeking knowledge. I didn't expect that you didn't learn much, but your courage to drink has increased a lot." Mistress Jian looked at him calmly. There was no pain in her simple and kind eyes. She just spoke calmly and straightforwardly. But it was this kind of normal conversation that brought great pressure to Ning Quebec. He did not know what to say, so he forced himself to calm down and tried to smile to relieve the awkwardness. But unexpectedly, he burped, and the smell was very unpleasant. Smelling the sour smell of alcohol in the room, Mistress Jian slightly frowned and glared at him unhappily. Then she smiled faintly and thought that her anger was unreasonable. She could not let the lad in front of her take the blame for that guy, could she? She looked at Ning Ke and asked as calmly as possible, "Tell me what you have learned in the academy these days." Ning Ke took the strong tea that Xiao Chao handed over and hurriedly drank 2 mouthfuls to calm his mind. After sincerely thanking her, he cleared his throat unhurriedly and earnestly told Mistress Jian about his life in the academy. "You're quite diligent, but since you have no foundation in calligraphy and rites, you should spend more effort on these 2 subjects, and not just ignore them like a broken jar. You should know that after you leave the academy in the future, whether you become an official in the imperial court or a herdsman, you will always need these skills." Hearing that Ning Ke went to the old library every day, Mistress Jian smiled, and the wrinkles at the corner of her eyes deepened. She continued to ask, "Since you go to the old library every day, you must know about the 2nd floor?" "Yes." Ning Ke replied politely. Mistress Jian thought for a while and then said seriously, "When do you think you can enter the 2nd floor?" Ning Ke raised his sleeve to cover his mouth, forcibly suppressing the desire to burp or even vomit. He shook his head and replied, "Anyone who can enter that place is a cultivation genius. But my body can't carry out cultivation at all, so I dare not have any thoughts of entering the 2nd floor. Can't you grow up a little? It's rare for you to enter such a good place like the academy, so you should cherish the opportunity to learn. Don't talk nonsense about being infatuated." Mistress Jian looked at him, frowning and shaking her head. She sighed at his lack of ambition. Years ago, she saw that guy riding a donkey and riding it all the way to the 2nd floor. Now she vaguely associated Ning Ke with that guy in her heart, and inevitably had some thoughts of making up for the regret. She could not help but continue to persuade him, "The academy itself is a place to create miracles. But if you don't think miracles can happen, then no one can help you." Ning Ke did not know that senior who rode a little black donkey straight into Chang and finally made a name for himself in the world, but eventually disappeared like duckweed in the wind and rain. Naturally, he did not understand why Mistress Jian paid so much attention to a poor boy like him. He knew there must be some reasons behind this attention, but he did not care what those reasons were. In the face of a kind woman's earnest teaching, he was still sincerely grateful. Because he had always lacked this part of his life. In his previous life, the back seat of a bicycle might be another form of care, but he did not like it. In this life, he also had it before he was 4 years old, but it was eventually swallowed by blood. Because he was sincerely grateful, or even moved, Ning Ke answered Mistress Jian's questions carefully and seriously, and his speed was a little slow. But in Mistress Jian's eyes, this made her feel a little annoyed. "You and I are neither relatives nor friends. If it were not for the passion in my heart, I would not have bothered to say these words to you. So don't have any negative feelings. I am not doing you any harm by asking you to cherish the opportunity to study in the academy. Mistress Jian looked at him seriously and said, last time I told you that rich young masters like Chu Yuxian can play here, but a poor boy like you is not qualified to play here. Today it is even more so. Chang and noble ladies like Miss Situ and Miss Jean can play here, but you are not qualified to play here. They are close to you because they find you amusing and are temporarily curious about you. This interest is not necessarily malicious, but it is not real respect. If you want to be their real friend, then you must have some ability and bearing that is worthy of their respect. If you can enter the second floor of the academy, I believe that everyone in the world will be willing to be your friend. Mistress Jian picked up the golden orchid dew on the table and took a sip to moisten her throat. Then she looked up at him and continued calmly, in the future, you can come to the brothel to relax, but not too often. You can't drink too much. I am a nanny in the brothel, so I don't think that loitering in the brothel is a lowly behavior, but I also don't think that it is a good thing to do. 30 years ago, the great poet Mr. Chao Ciyuan spent the first half of his life in the brothel, but who dared to disrespect him? He even married the Prime Minister's daughter, but it was not because he had made a name for himself in the brothel, but because his poetry was unparalleled in the world and he was talented. The Tang Empire values talent. As long as you have talent and you are a talent, no matter if you are upstairs or downstairs, inside or outside the brothel, a boy from the border town or a noble in Chang'an, the empire will not bury you. After the lecture, Ning Ke went downstairs with his hand on his forehead and found that the gathering in the hall had ended. After asking the steward in the building, he found out that eldest young Miss Situ was the one who finally paid for the gathering of his classmates. When he heard this news and thought about how he could maintain his 2,000 taels of silver for a while longer, he couldn't help but feel very lucky. When he was about to say goodbye to Dewdrop and the others, the maidservant Xiao Chao, who had received Mistress Jian's order, chased him to the horse carriage and ordered the coachman to send the drunken lad back to Lin 47th Street as fast as possible. Sitting in the galloping horse carriage, Ning Ke felt like dying, drunk, and nauseous. But somehow, his mind was clear and he kept thinking about that serious question. I did not hesitate to destroy my body and spirit to stay in the old library to enter the second floor of the academy. It was because I like it, but also because I want to take revenge and improve my strength. Do I have to add another reason in the future, to be able to roam the brothel? When Ning Ke was lost in his thoughts on the horse carriage, another guest came to Dewdrop's courtyard. As one of the popular girls in the House of Red Sleeves, she had the right to choose and even reject guests to a certain extent, except for regular guests like the censor Zhang Yiqi. But for this guest who just entered the courtyard late at night, she just forcibly wiped away the gloomy expression on her face and forced herself to pour tea for him. Go wash your face. A pretty girl like you can't be as dirty as me. The guest who entered the courtyard late at night was a tall and thin old man wearing an extremely old Taoist robe. His robe was stained with oil stains here and there seemed to be a few leftover rice grains between the lapels of the robe. It was extremely dirty. The tall and thin Taoist's face was not dirty, but there were a few sparse long beards under his chin. His inverted triangular eyes flickered, and his obscene aura was extremely dirty. Dewdrop smiled and followed the maidservant to freshen up. She only knew that this guest was important and was a distinguished guest who was personally invited by Mistress Jian. But she did not know who he was or what kind of business he did. As for external things such as appearance and clothes, they were never the focus of her or the maidservant's attention. What was important was that this Taoist had always been extremely generous. Moreover, he called himself the primordial spirit protector. He had come 2 or 3 times, but he only took action and refused to be serious. There was no reason for the girls in the brothel not to like this kind of guest. The dirty, skinny and tall Taoist poured himself a cup of wine and drank it slowly. Just as he was feeling bored, he saw a crumpled piece of paper beside the wine pot. It was the most ordinary paper for an account book. He could vaguely see the handwriting on it. Based on his habit of cultivating for decades, he instinctively picked up the crumpled paper and carefully spread it on the table. There was a line of ink written on the crumpled paper. The words were unclear, and the frame was crooked and messy, which made it unpleasant to look at. On the paper was written, "Young Master Sang, I'm drunk today and won't be coming back to sleep. Remember to drink the leftover chicken soup on the pot." Looking at these words, the tall and thin Daoist's brows furrowed tightly. But what was surprising was that when he furrowed his brows, he did not show disgust, but surprise and joy. The tall and thin Taoist carefully read the words that looked like a chicken's claw. His eyes finally fell on the word chicken soup at the end of the sentence. His right hand, which was as skinny as an old tree trunk, dipped into the wine cup, and then put his fingers on the table and began to copy, stroke by stroke. The wine on his fingers dragged on the mahogany table to form words, which were very similar to the word chicken soup written by Ning Ke on the paper. Vaguely, there seemed to be streams of air flowing through the tall and thin Taoist's fingers into the wine, seeping into the depths of the hard mahogany, and then instantly dispersed into countless tiny cyclones and disappeared without a trace. Dewdrop, who was dressing up outside the room, seemed to have sensed something. She looked at the reflection of the sky full of stars in the basin in front of her and was stunned. She did not know why she suddenly felt homesick. She missed the warm home that only existed in her imagination and had never appeared in her life. She missed the taste of her mother's chicken soup that she had never tasted before. Chapter 101. The lanky Taoist dipped his finger in the wine and wrote on the mahogany table. Soon he copied the 29 characters on the account book paper. He put his finger into his dry lips and licked it. Then he put his hands behind his back, lowered his body and put his face close to the table. He carefully continued to examine the paper on the account book paper. As he read, he frowned more and more, shook his head more and more frequently, and looked more and more confused. He murmured, "What kind of writing is this? I've never seen it before. There is no fluctuation of primordial qi, but why is the meaning of the brush so abundant? It's obviously scattered to the point of a mess, but why can it make people suddenly nervous after concentrating on it?" The lanky Taoist shook his head and stood up straight. He walked half a circle in the room and then quickly walked back to the mahogany table. He lowered his head and continued to look at the handwriting on the account book paper. He still frowned and shook his head, saying repeatedly, "It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Does it make sense? It doesn't make sense." No matter how the three major cultivation sects or countries quarreled with each other, no one dared to disrespect the divine talisman master. That was because there were few cultivators in the world, and the divine talisman master was even rarer. The divine talisman master, who stood between the secular world and the secular cultivation, could create wind and rain and startle ghosts and gods when he wrote. He was too important for cultivation and war, and was an almost non-renewable resource. The Tang Empire was the most powerful country in the world. However, it never had more than 10 divine talisman masters. Most of them had already left the secular world and lived in seclusion in the academy or in the forest. They devoted their remaining life to finding the secrets between the veins of heaven and earth. There were not many divine talisman masters who were still in the world. 2 of the 4 divine talisman masters in the South School of Haotian Taoism were messengers sent to Cheng and by the West Hill Divine Palace to show their power. They did not stay in Cheng and for long, so there were only 2 divine talisman masters in the South School of Haotian Taoism. The lanky priest who visited the House of Red Sleeves at night was one of the 2 divine talisman masters. His name was Yen Se, the senior brother of Li Qingfeng, the nation master of the Tang Empire, and the High Minister of Offerings of the South School of Haotian Taoism. He was fond of strong wine, beautiful women, and wonderful books. In terms of the art of calligraphy and talisman, he was already one of the top figures in the world. That night when it was raining heavily in the spring rain, he drew a well talisman with the help of the rainwater in the alley and scared Wang Jinglu, the cultivation genius of the Tang Empire, who was known to be invincible below knowing destiny, into a crying fat boy. In addition to all kinds of magical talisman techniques, divine talisman masters were most praised for their wonderful realm and ability of painting on the desk and paper. There was a saying in the world that a great painter could not become a divine talisman master if he did not have the potential for cultivation. However, all divine talisman masters must be great calligraphers or great painters who could leave their names in history. Yen Sei was a divine talisman master who frequented brothels for pleasure. As long as he was willing, he could become a leading figure in the world of calligraphy. But such a figure was so interested in the scribbled handwriting on an account book that he could not understand it even after racking his brains. If the calligraphers of the Tang Empire or the powerhouses in the cultivation world saw this scene, they would definitely be shocked speechless. And they would definitely be very curious about who on earth was this person who could write these words that could make a divine talisman master feel distressed. It was not because Ning Ke had great ability that the dignified divine talisman master Yen Sei, racking his brains, could not understand a piece of cursive handwriting. It was because of various reasons that he happened to be in a certain state of mind when he wrote this note tonight. Today, he was enlightened when he read the books in the old building. He forgot the meaning of the words but remembered their shapes. Feeling happy and enlightened, he went to the brothel with his classmates to drink. In a daze, he randomly picked up the brush pen to write cursive handwriting. Then, he naturally followed the principles that he understood when he read the books in the brothel in the daytime and forgot all the strict rules of writing. Even when he was drunk, he subconsciously scattered all the rules of writing. He twisted the plum blossoms and overturned the grape trellis. But this writing method was different. It wedged the hidden interest of the cultivation method from another stiff and clumsy way. If it was another great calligrapher in Chang'an City who read this cursive handwriting, he would not feel much. But in the eyes of a divine talisman master, he always felt that he had scratched his own itch. It was a secret place on his back that he had not scratched for 60 years. It was a place that he had not scratched in the past 60 years. But once he knew it, it itched to the bone. As for the divine talisman master Yen Sei saying that Ning Ke's cursive handwriting could not be understood, it was not wrong at all. Because Ning Ke did not understand the principles of cultivation, and the snow mountain and ocean of qi acupoints in his body were still blocked. Now he just wanted to find a winding and long path to go up the mountain, but there was still a huge rock at the end of the path. How could he get through? The meaning of the words meant that every stroke in the middle and the following strokes contained the intention and thought of the calligrapher at that time. Ning Ke's cursive handwriting of 29 words could be said to be incomprehensible. That was because he could not understand it, so the meaning was trapped in the ink and could not be penetrated. But now that the dignified divine talisman master Yen Sei had copied it, no matter how powerful Tao Chi was, he could no longer imprison the intention in the strokes and words. The wine seeped into the hard mahogany table, and the wine spread to the air and then spread to the whole house of red sleeves. At that time, Ning Ke was drunk when he wrote this to Sang Sang. It seemed that he wanted to express his intention to stay in the house of red sleeves for the night. But when the true meaning hidden in the ink was fully released, it revealed his true intention. He did not think that was his intention, or he was not willing to admit it. In the courtyard of a few plum trees in the west, Lu Shui was silent with a long flute in her arms. Her beautiful and haggard face was full of sorrow. Looking at the old plum trees in the corner of the courtyard, she missed the spring in her hometown in the south. In the courtyard of a few bamboo trees in the east, Dewdrop stared blankly at the basin full of stars. Bright tears rolled down her smooth cheeks like pearls and fell into the basin, making a soft sound. In the quiet room on the top floor, behind the bead curtain, Mistress Jian looked at the portrait beside the bed. Her broad forehead wrinkled into a deep frown. She looked at the young scholar riding a black donkey in the portrait. She looked at his familiar raised eyebrows and looked at his spirited and even arrogant laughter. Tears slowly flowed down her face. She murmured in a low voice, "Kaharan, you bastard. I made chicken soup for you every day when you came back, but you didn't come. Now, even if you wanted to drink it, you can't. I don't know, how are you living in the underground?" Suddenly, she raised her eyebrows and woke up with a tight grip on the silk handkerchief in her hand. She hurried to the railing and looked at the courtyard downstairs. She knew the identity of the thin and tall Taoist in Dewdrop's courtyard, but she was not afraid at all. She scolded softly with an angry face, "You old man, you are so unreasonable. Why did you come to my house to provoke me? Why did you think of that bastard?" In the courtyard, Dewdrop, who had washed her face and put on some light makeup, walked back to the room leisurely. When she saw the tall and thin Taoist shaking his head by the table, she couldn't help but be slightly startled. She walked up to him and took a look. She frowned and asked doubtfully, "Sir, why did I smell chicken soup earlier?" "It's not the smell of chicken soup. It's the smell of going home." The divine talisman master Yen Sei shook his head and pointed at the 29 characters scribbled in ink on the account book. He said, "When this man wrote this note, he was very anxious to go home and drink the leftover chicken soup. The chicken soup may not be delicious. I'm just curious about Sang Sang, who should be a woman. I don't know whether she is his fierce wife or strict mother. How could she force him to be like this? Isn't this note written by Ning Ke?" Dewdrop's delicate face was full of confusion. He didn't look like he wanted to go home at that time. Sang Sang is not his wife, but his little handmaiden. Little handmaiden? That's even more unreasonable. The divine talisman master Yen Sei shook his head and no longer cared about this matter. He had never married in his life because he had seen too many fierce wives like tigers in the Tang Empire, especially in Chang'an. He only wanted to linger in the bushes of flowers and taste fresh food all day long. Therefore, he could not understand why a little handmaiden and a bowl of leftover chicken soup were worth so much of his attention. The next morning, the thin and tall Taoist left in a carriage without asking who the person who wrote the 29 characters was. After a while, Dewdrop walked over while yawning and rubbing her sleepy eyes. She had long forgotten all the emotions from last night. She took a sip of the hot tea served by the maidservant and subconsciously glanced at the table. She found that the tattered account book and notepad had disappeared, and the 29 cursive characters that the lanky Taoist had copied on the mahogany table with his finger had long dried up and disappeared. She shook her head with a smile and put down the teacup in her hand. The emerald bracelet on her wrist gently knocked on the mahogany table. A very light sound was heard, and a very fine red paint powder was shaken off the table. Dewdrop was slightly shocked and opened her eyes to look at it curiously. After a moment of hesitation, she gently wiped it with the silk handkerchief in her sleeve. Under the red paint powder was a row of extremely sloppy handwriting. These handwriting did not seem to be deep, but the traces were so deep in the wood that it could not be erased. It could be said that the handwriting had penetrated deep into the wood. "Young Master Sang Sang, I'm drunk today, so I won't come back to sleep. Remember to drink the remaining chicken soup in the pot." Dewdrop opened her eyes and stared at the scribbled handwriting on the mahogany table. She vaguely understood something. She did not know that the skinny, tall Taoist was the legendary divine talisman master, nor could she see how great karma Ning Ke would have in the future. However, she knew that the skinny, tall Taoist must have an extraordinary background. She sincerely hoped that Ning Ke would have a great karma Ning Ke would have in the future. More importantly, she had a natural sensitivity to opportunities after having seen countless people. Thus, she immediately ordered the maidservant to carefully put away the table and keep it safe for the future. On the other side, the divine talisman master Yen Sei went out of the brothel and boarded a shabby carriage. After a short journey in Chang'an City, he met a young Taoist with a yellow paper umbrella under his armpit. The young Taoist respectfully replied, "Uncle, I found out what you asked me to do. That person is called Ning Ke, and he escorted the princess. Liu Qingchen has seen him and confirmed that he has no potential. I've also seen him in the academy a few days ago, but he did not even enter the course of magic skills." The divine talisman master sighed with pity. Not to mention the relationship between the lad and her highness, it was already a hopeless situation that he could not open all his acupoints. Did he have to ask the Westhill Divine Palace to gather the power of several great divine priests to help this lad open his acupoints by force? It was hard to find a successor for the wonderful talisman technique. Last night, he finally met one, but he was congenitally deficient. What a pity. Then, he would climb the stairs again and again, holding the book in his hand. Under the sun, he read the ink characters under the west window. He used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to disassemble all the characters in the thin book into individual strokes. Then, he would carefully experience the direction and meaning of those strokes and deliberately forget their meaning. The female professor was still quietly writing the hairpin-style small regular script by the east window. He did not know when she untied her hair bun, but the soft short hair above her ears reflected the growing spring scenery outside the window. She was extremely gentle and also extremely silent. No matter how sincere Ning Kei's attitude was, she refused to give any advice. After a few days in the afternoon, he finally flipped to the middle part of the book, a preliminary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. The ink characters reflected in his eyes were disassembled into thousands of strokes, and then reassembled into thousands of different shapes and inexplicable meanings of Yong. It almost completely exhausted his mental and physical strength. Ning Kei rubbed his sore eyes and silently turned his head to look at the increasingly fat green leaves outside the window. He knew that it was meaningless to force himself to continue reading. Even if he continued to squeeze out the last of his mental perseverance, it would only help him to understand more about the meaning of the talisman master who copied the book. It would not provide any help to him to step into the initial state. What disappointed him the most was that on the piece of paper in the middle of the thin book, there were no more notes left behind by that mysterious teacher. There wasn't even a word or two, as if that person had disappeared. The cicadas that had troubled the students of the academy for thousands of years began their cycle of reincarnation without warning in this afternoon. Ning Kei quietly listened to the noisy cicadas outside the window. After a long time, he suddenly turned his head and closed the thin book on his knees. Then, he closed his eyes and began to meditate. He used the 8 strokes calligraphy method of Yong to compose the meaning of the strokes, and then forcibly dispersed his mind to forget the meaning of the words. Therefore, although there were many strokes and they could barely stay in a corner of the spiritual world, once he began to meditate on these strokes, the complicated strokes would become dangerous. On the first day, when Ning Kei felt that the psyche power in his chest and abdomen had no way forward, he knew that it would be very dangerous to forcibly meditate on it. Therefore, he did not try it again these days. He only hoped that it was right in front of him in the human world. If he watched it slip away to the netherworld in the horizon, it was absolutely unacceptable to him. Therefore, he had to try again at this moment. He closed his eyes and sat cross-legged by the window, motionless for a long time like a statue. A warm spring breeze blew in from the west window and blew on his light green robe, causing ripples. Those traces slowly protruded on the surface of the green robe outside his chest and abdomen, and then calmed down. They protruded again and calmed down again, as if they had some kind of spirituality, or as if some wonderful life had come to life. It was a pity that those traces could not be connected after all. They were isolated in a corner and could not be touched no matter which direction they went. Their spirituality was blocked and life had no foundation. In a small pond in the academy, the lake water was gently disturbed by the wind, and the slight waves pushed a few small round duckweed on the surface to swing around. But no matter which direction the duckweed swayed to, it would eventually touch the wall of the pond and fall back. In a deep mountain somewhere in the world, a famous scholar went through the dense forest to visit a famous monastery. He knocked on the wooden door of a small temple, only to find that the great virtue-eminent monk had already traveled around the world. The famous scholar could only shake his head and climb up the stairs to retreat. He looked back at the broken road in the forest, feeling very resentful. In Ning Kei's spiritual world at this moment, those extremely complicated strokes, those partial radicals that had been decomposed into no specific meaning, and those horizontal and vertical lines and ink spots, suddenly became vivid as he tried to meditate on them. The ink marks had sharp metal edges and became the frightening saber array of the golden tribe of the barbarians on the grassland. The tip of the brush was infinitely wet and became the cold rain outside the spring breeze pavilion. It began to fall. When it fell, countless heads were chopped off, and when it fell, it became a rainstorm. It was majestic and endless, only endless conflicts. All of a sudden, the whole world stopped. He suddenly opened his eyes and left the state of meditation. He felt a sharp pain in his chest and could not help but lower his head to cough. The slightly hoarse cough instantly broke the silence on the second floor of the old library. He hurriedly lifted his sleeve to cover his mouth, only to find that the sleeve was stained with some scarlet blood spots. The headmaster of the academy once said that doing things by force is a very boring thing. Your body is not suitable for cultivation. Although you have amazing perseverance and even found a very interesting way, but, since it is impossible, don't persist. Unknowingly, the female professor had already walked to Ning Ke and said softly while looking at him with gentle eyes. Ning Ke looked up and found that the female professor was extremely small, with thin eyebrows and clear eyes. He could not tell how old she was. He knew that in the previous dangerous moment, she must have used some method to forcibly call him out of meditation. He could not help laughing at himself, stood up, wiped the blood stains on the corner of his mouth, and sincerely bowed to her. The female professor smiled and shook her head, indicating that he did not need to be so serious. After slightly nodding, she walked to the depth of the bookshelf with the hairpin-style small regular script, and somehow got out of the old library. Unconsciously, Ning Ke spent a lot of time meditating. It was already dusk outside the building. When the night was about to come, he did not hurry to leave, but quietly stood under the west window, listening to the intermittent chirping of cicadas due to lack of practice. Then he walked to the desk, ground the ink, and wrote a paragraph on the paper. Late at night, the talisman on the bookshelf in the depth of the second floor of the old library shone again, and then quietly slid to both sides. Accompanied by heavy gasps, Chin Pippi squeezed out with great difficulty, and his fat face was very funny with trembling flesh. After leaving those words that night, he had been concerned about Ning Ke's progress. However, because Ning Ke had asked for sick leave, he did not get a reply for several days, which made him angry and more curious. Unfortunately, second brother, who had given him the most headache and fear these days, suddenly asked his classmates to collectively learn the ancient ritual procedures. Under the continuous bombardment of fatigue, he had no time and energy to come over. Finally, Chin Pippi had some free time today. Without taking a bath and resting, he hurried to the old library, just to see if there was any reply from the poor and hateful guy. Walking to the bookshelf, Chin Pippi took out the thin primary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow. He raised his thick eyebrows and made a slight sound. After reading it for a while, he could not help but shake his head in praise. This guy is really bold and ambitious. He actually came up with such a stupid method, and can actually understand it? What he read was naturally Ning Ke's first reply, and then he saw Ning Ke's latest message today. His thick lips could not help but smack more loudly. He frowned and said in distress, "You don't even know this, and you still want to play cultivation? I really don't know whether you are a genius or an idiot." After a moment of silence, Chin Pippi sat at the desk by the west window, ground the ink, and began to reply. In the second exchange between him and Ning Ke, this genius student from West Hill wrote, "Are you a child? Don't you even know such a basic truth? Since you don't know anything, you naturally can't resonate with the breath of heaven and earth. There is no other way. If you want to know the specific reason, I can only give you an analogy. Our body is like a musical instrument, such as a flute. Psyche power is the breath of heaven and earth in the flute. Beautiful music can't be played with the flute and the breath, because the sound comes from the holes of the flute. If there are no holes on your flute, how can you play? Heaven and earth can't hear your music, how can you sense it? There are so many acupoints in your ocean of Qi and mountain of snow that are blocked. How do you still want to play? The computer network of the Austrian hotel is as bad as that of the German hotel. I tried my best to write it last night, but I just couldn't send it. Fortunately, I can now. Also, dear readers, it's going to be a long-distance flight back home soon. If I can write it on the plane, I won't stop updating tomorrow. If I can't write it on the plane, it will be terrible. I will confirm whether there is an update before 8 o'clock on the 19th and report to you by then. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 103. Morning. Morning. Have you finished copying the 3 teaching plans for today's calligraphy course? Not yet. I'm in a hurry. Then you guys have to hurry up. I heard that the teacher will give marks during the class. The marks will take up a large proportion of the semester exam. If we can't pass the exam, no one will be able to help us. The semester exam even counts the daily grades? I heard from my uncle that he was like that at that time. If Professor Wu wants to check who can memorize the 3,748 words of the declaration of war against Yen, I'm sure I can't recite it. You'd better remind me of the beginning of the sentence. Of course. My problem is that I can't recite it even if you remind me of the words. In the early morning in front of the academy, the students came down from the horse carriages and greeted each other. The sun was shining in the sky, and birds were singing in the woods behind the courtyard. As the spring deepened and the summer approached, the temperature became higher and higher. The young students had already changed into the summer clothes of the academy. The clothes were soft and breathable, and their sleeves fluttered in the morning breeze, which made them look more free and fresh than usual. As usual, they began their daily life in this way. They seemed to be complaining and nervous, but secretly they were full of youthful confidence. Ning Kei stood among his schoolmates and answered them with a warm smile. Looking at the excited expressions on their faces that had been forcibly wiped away, he could not help but feel that it was funny. He thought to himself that although the stars and moon were no longer here, some things were always so similar. The annual semester exam was one of the most important teaching ceremonies in the academy. Its importance was second only to the internship exam for Tang students and the final exam of the academy. How could the young and competitive students not take it seriously? Maybe those guys who complained last night that they had no time to review the teaching plans had stayed up until the early morning and only slept for a short while. Now they could recite the words fluently, but they had to deliberately show that they were relaxed and even lazy. The ordinary morning study began with Wu Chintian, the Academy's professor of literature, reading with a strong Jiaozhou accent. Although Wu Chintian was so impassioned when he read Wang Chongren's war declaration against Yen in the Qinghua period, the students could not understand his accent, so the atmosphere in the school inevitably seemed a bit dull. In the end, the old professor wetted 3 handkerchiefs and half of his green sleeves, but all he got in return was the students' silent yawns. Fortunately, the old man did not ask his students to stand up and recite the denunciation against Yen at the last minute. He probably knew that he could still recite this extremely long denunciation after 40 years, but it was not suitable for him to use this standard to ask his students. When the bell rang for the 3rd time, Ning Kei finally felt relieved. He hastily packed his stationery and books and rushed out of classroom 3. He crossed the clear alley and stepped on the stone path along the edge of the wetland to the old library. Now that he used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to read books and forget the meaning, it was no longer like before when he would faint while reading. Therefore, he did not need to be so strict on food and rest. More importantly, he was very curious, or rather, looking forward to the question he left yesterday. He wanted to know how the mysterious messenger would answer. Thump, 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 thump. Ning Kei went upstairs, brushed his clothes with his sleeves, and bowed respectfully to the gentle female professor by the east window. He quickly walked back to the bookshelf, took out the thin book A Preliminary Exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow, and opened it as fast as he could. Pulling out the paper with dense handwriting, Ning Kei suppressed his excitement and looked at it, and then fell into a long silence. Our bodies are like musical instruments. For example, if it's a flute, psyche power is the qi that recovers in the flute. With the flute and the qi, it doesn't mean that beautiful music can be played, because the sound comes from the flute holes. If there are no holes on your flute, how can you play? Heaven and earth can't hear your music, how can you feel it? There are so many acupoints in your ocean of qi and mountain of snow that are blocked. What else do you want to do? Ning Ke looked at the message on the paper and raised his head after a long time. He shook his head and looked at the dense forest outside the window with a helpless smile. Listening to the sound of cicadas outside the window, he let out a very slight sigh and said, "It turns out that this is the truth. It turns out that I am a flute that can't be played." Then he looked down at his chest and abdomen. His eyes fell on the thin green academy uniform, and he imagined the ocean of chi and mountain of snow in his flesh and bones under the cloth. He seemed to see a lot of clumsy stone mountains that had no acupoints, no rugged paths, and no sound no matter how the waves beat or how the lake wind blew. The person who can write such words is really a genius. He couldn't help but look at the handwriting on the paper again and silently praised in his heart, using pushing down a woman to talk about the principle of reading books and forgetting the meaning, and then coming up with such a wonderful metaphor of playing a flute. If this person is an instructor, he must be the top instructor in the academy. While praising, Ning Ke inevitably felt a little gloomy when he thought of the lakeside stone mountain without acupoints in his body and himself, a stupid piece of wood that couldn't find a hole. He sighed and put the primary exploration of the ocean of chi and mountain of snow back on the bookshelf and began to walk among the bookshelves. Knowing the relationship between the acupoints in the ocean of chi and mountain of snow, psyche power and the breath of heaven and earth, and knowing that the congenital body constitution was limited, Ning Ke couldn't really step into that world even if he could use some stupid methods to look at the world and fulfill some wishes. Ning Ke felt that it was meaningless to continue reading books by reading words and forgetting the meaning, because for him, walking into that world was far more important than having a glimpse of that world from afar. He didn't want to disturb the female professor who was writing words in the east window, so he deliberately slowed down and lightened his steps when walking back and forth among the bookshelves. The expression on his face had become very calm, or it should be said that he seemed to be calm. His calm eyes gently swept over the densely packed cultivation books on the bookshelves. The titles on the spines of the books, which he felt were incomparably mysterious at first glance, were still a great temptation for him at this time, but also a very annoying torture. Suddenly, he saw a book at the bottom corner of the second row of bookshelves. He subconsciously raised his eyebrows and looked a little surprised. There were countless precious and mysterious cultivation books hidden on this floor, but this book was definitely not the most remarkable one among them. But the name of this book reminded him of some past events. The name of this book was Wu Zhanyang's Theory on Haoran Sword. It was the words Haoran Sword that reminded Ning Ke of the first cultivator he met on the battlefield in his life, the great sword master in a green robe who intended to kill Princess Li Yu at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road. That great sword master was an abandoned disciple of the academy, and he cultivated in Haoran Sword. He squatted down and pulled out the book of Haoran Sword. After hesitating for a moment, he walked back to the wooden floor where he usually sat, and sat in the warm spring sunshine. After calming down for a moment, he opened the book. The cicadas outside the window were even louder, and the forest seemed more quiet. The rest of the students downstairs were either drowsy because of the cicadas, or they were all licking the tips of their pens to prepare for the semester exam in a month. Ning Ke sat alone on the floor, sitting between the cicadas and the silence. All of a sudden, his face suddenly turned pale. He clenched his right hand into a fist and hit hard on his chest, forcibly shaking himself out of the state of meditation. He dared not look at the pages of the book again. He was still reading the book in the way of 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. Similarly, he also faintly felt that there was some kind of aura in his body, which flowed slowly in his chest and abdomen along with the strokes, and then disappointedly met the lake wall. But he did not expect that the words and strokes in this book of Wu Zhanyang's Theory on Haoran Sword were so sharp that they did not turn back when they met the lake wall. Instead, they coldly and mercilessly stabbed forward with the aura in his body. It was this stab that made Ning Ke feel as if a real cold sword was formed inside his body and then pierced through his heart. The pain was so horrible that even he, who had been between life and death countless times and had been seriously injured many times, could not bear it when he was unprepared. If he were an ordinary person, he might scream at this moment and then fall to the ground with a pale face. Then he would be sent into the real world by the emptiness realm, twitching all over and fainting. But Ning Ke was not an ordinary person. He had many similar or even more painful experiences than this one. When he was 11 years old, he took Sang Sang through the vast Min Mountain for the umpteenth time. Once he lost his footing and fell off the cliff. Fortunately, he was stopped by a hard tree sticking out of the cliff, so he did not fall to his death. However, the tree's sword-like branches that stretched towards the sky directly pierced through his chest and back. Even with such heavy injuries, he still survived. Moreover, from that day onwards, there was no pain that could make him feel fear and despair. Ning Ke, who was hanging from the branches on the cliff, was not dead. Ning Ke, who was sitting on the floor under the sunlight, would not have any problems. He did not even let out a groan. He only panted a few times and then calmed down. He looked at the closed book again with a complicated expression on his face. He murmured in a low voice, "Pain leads to impassibility, and the passage leads to no pain. This is really an everlasting truth that has been passed down since ancient times." He shook his head and leaned back against the bookshelf. He raised his sleeve to cover his mouth and coughed twice, guessing that his lungs might have been injured by the Howran sword hidden in the pages of the book. But strangely, he did not look depressed at all at this moment. Instead, there was a faint excitement. Pain leads to impassibility. So if I endure the pain and force my way through, naturally it will not hurt anymore, right? At this moment, Ning Ke thought of the waterfall that seemed to be the Milky Way falling from the ninth heaven. He thought of the black oil gushing out from the wilderness. He thought of the broken fire hydrant and the beautiful bare-legged girl in a flowery skirt beside the fire hydrant. She looked nervous but was actually excited. He also thought of countless sages and sages in martial arts novels. Those fellows whose blocked meridians would be cleared after a nap, those who lost all their power and slept in a tomb for a few years wrapped in unfinished silk, those who became invincible after cutting themselves with a knife and severing their conception and governing vessels, those who turned themselves into a great grandmaster of the one meridian after their meridians were all severed, those who turned themselves into a great grandmaster of the one meridian. If those old guys and little guys could do it, why couldn't he? If those guys could succeed in the end because they all had some kind of stubbornness in their temperament, then would his stubbornness be less than theirs? Determination and arrogance flashed in Ning Ke's clean eyes. He struggled to stand up with the help of the bookshelf and walked to the desk beside the west window. He ground the ink and moistened the brush. He left a message for that guy. "I do understand the importance of impassibility. If Haotian is destined to make me impassibility for the rest of my life, then I have to do it myself. I finally came out before 12 o'clock. What's even better is that this chapter doesn't seem to need any major repairs. Excellent. I'll bow down and go to sleep. The day after tomorrow, it's going to be midnight. Dear, I'm going to die. Oh, dear, if you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 104. After class on the second day, the students in the study room did not leave with laughter as usual, but looked at the door of the study room one after another, looking puzzled and slightly surprised. Standing at the door were Xie Qingyun, Zhong Dajuan, and several companions. They were students of grade A dormitory, and no one knew why they came here today. The academy had opened for more than a month, and the students gradually became familiar with each other, and the dormitories gradually became a group. Although there was no dispute among them for the time being, there would always be some relatively antagonistic mentality. Therefore, after seeing Xie Qingyun and Zhong Dajuan at the door, the students of classroom 3 were curious and somewhat vigilant. Xie Qingyun from the South Jin Kingdom had not gone upstairs these days, and his body had recovered well, and his face was no longer pale. He calmly faced the suspicious and vigilant eyes of the students of classroom 3, and slowly walked forward with his companions behind him. They walked to somewhere behind the study room, and then took out a letter from his sleeve and very seriously and solemnly handed it over. Ning Ke had been calmly looking at the door. He had thought that his target might be Jean Wuxia or one of the Chang and noblewomen in the front row, and then there might be a romantic affair. He did not expect that he would go straight to the back of the study room, and his target turned out to be himself. After thinking for a while, he stood up and looked at him with a slight smile. Looking at the craft paper letter between his fingers, he asked, "Is this an invitation or does Xie Qingyun want to invite me to dinner?" Xie Qingyun glanced at Zhong Dajuan beside him, and then looked at Ning Ke seriously and calmly said, "It's not an invitation, but a letter of challenge. I want to have a gentleman's competition with you in the semester exam of the academy a month later, to see who can get the first place. Since it's a gentleman's competition, I won't take advantage of you. It's limited to the 3 courses above A in the academy entrance exam." In the academy entrance exam, Ning Ke's total score was not very eye-catching, but he got A+ in the 3 subjects of writing, archery, and mathematics, which forcibly surpassed Xie Qingyun, Zhong Dajuan, Lin Xuan, and Wang Ying. The so-called indignation and unwillingness probably started from that moment. Coupled with the sensational competition later, Xie Qingyun, a talent from the South Jin Kingdom who had been proud of his peers since childhood, had to admit that compared with this seemingly ordinary border town soldier, he seemed to be always losing. He came to the Tang Empire with the glory of his family and even the South Jin Kingdom on his shoulders. He could not allow himself to keep losing. Zhong Dajuan and his other companions kept stirring things up, so he decided to find an opportunity to take back all the glory that once belonged to him. The semester examination of the academy was the best opportunity. Ning Ke was slightly startled, for he had never thought that it would be like this. For him, he had not come into contact with this game of using exam results to fight for his pride for many years. To be more precise, since he was severely taught by his mother with a mop in the 1st grade of primary school, he had always got full marks, and had never met a classmate who dared to challenge him in learning. More importantly, in this life, he was used to challenging on the edge of a knife and between life and death. Suddenly finding that these young classmates were still at this level, he could not help but feel a little childish and funny. Thinking of this, he could not help laughing. He looked at Xie Qingyun and wanted to say something, but found that he could not make it clear to such a son of an aristocratic family. A short silence and a gentle smile had different meanings in different people's eyes. Zhong Dajuan knew that Ning Ke was not a timid person, so he sneered and said, "Are you afraid?" Finding that the students of Grade A dormitory came to send a letter of challenge, the students of Grade C dormitory were shocked into silence at first, and then it turned into a whispered discussion. At this time, hearing Zhong Dajuan's sarcasm and provocation, although the students of Grade C dormitory were afraid of famous people like Xie Qingyun and Zhong Dajuan, they could not help but get angry and shouted, "Ning Ke, take this letter." Situ Yi stood up and glanced at Ning Quebec. When she was about to say something, Ning Ke shook his head and stopped her. He naturally reached out to take the letter, looked at Xie Qingyun in front of him and asked, "Although it is not a duel of cutting sleeves or cutting palms, I think since you insist on using this childish and cute way to get back the lost dignity, you will definitely put forward the relevant bet about winning or losing." Then he added with a smile, "The bet can't be too excessive. If the loser wants to go to the old library to hug the big pillar and shout, 'I love Her Majesty,' then I will give up in advance." As soon as this remark came out, there was an exaggerated laughter in the study room. Xie Qingyun also laughed and said, "Since it is a gentleman's competition, what we want is nothing more than academic progress. The loser should treat the winner to a meal." The bet was nothing more than a meal. As the saying goes, it is raised high and then it is lowered gently. Behind Xie Qingyun, Zhong Dajuan heard that he suddenly changed the original bet, and could not help showing anger in his eyes. However, the students of Grade C dormitory thought that Xie Qingyun's proposal was very graceful and had a better impression of him. Ning Ke shook his head indifferently and looked at Xie Qingyun with a smile. He said softly, "A gentleman's competition. If I don't accept your challenge, am I not a gentleman? Although I am not a gentleman, and I don't want to be one, I think you are not a gentleman when you use words to force people to submit." Xie Qingyun slightly changed his expression and said nothing more. The challenge of Xia Qingyun, a talent of the South Jin Kingdom, caused a sensation among the academy students. The students of grade C dormitory were not in a hurry to go home or get a meal, but stayed excitedly, discussing and analyzing the possible results and giving suggestions for Ning Ke with a spirit of collectivism. Situ Ilan even came up with the idea of asking the sharpshooter of the military ministry to give Ning Ke special training again. Ning Ke himself looked very calm and natural, just smiled and apologized and left the study room. Compared with the great fear between life and death, other things were not so scary. If he acted solemnly, it would be in vain and make others laugh. For Ning Ke, who had experienced too many great fears between life and death, Xia Qingyun's serious challenge letter was such a funny childish trick. He accepted the challenge letter not because he wanted to review the past and regain the glory of winning the whole school list, but because he didn't have too much energy to say anything to these youthful classmates. Now his whole mind was on the top of the old library, on the humble mountain without aperture acupoints. He went upstairs again, bowed respectfully to the east window, and then walked to the west window. On the way, he stopped at the bookshelf and pulled out the thin book. After opening it, he found that there was no message from the mysterious man on the paper, so he regretfully sighed and put the book back. Then he pulled out Wu Zhanyang's theory on Haoran's sword from the bottom of the bookshelf on the third floor and began to read the book with his legs crossed. If Ning Ke was now lying in front of a steep and difficult mountain, then what he was doing now was what the foolish old man had done. Even if he couldn't climb over the mountain, he would forcibly dig a few ventilation tunnels from the middle. The foolish old man had stepped on many pairs of straw sandals and dug many holes to move the mountain. He was a guy with great perseverance. However, if he, who had no modern engineering knowledge, went to dig countless tunnels on both sides of the mountain, he would eventually be like a loach drilling through tofu, and helplessly dig a tofu dregs project that kept moving forward and collapsing. Even if he had the body of Vajra, it would be in vain for him to dig for thousands of years. It was a very beautiful wish that man could conquer nature, which could motivate human beings to keep moving forward at the spiritual level. But in specific cases, not everything could be completed perfectly by perseverance alone. Back to the foolish old man who was worshipped as an idol by Ning Ke and many male protagonists. When people questioned him, he said that his children and grandchildren were endless, but the mountain was always there, so one day it would be dug out. This sentence was very refreshing and vigorous, and vaguely in line with the true meaning of the headmaster's question of cutting peach blossoms and drinking wine. The so-called endless. However, the foolish old man didn't know a cruel truth, that was, the mountain would sometimes grow taller. In the next few days, the pen and ink were like swords, stabbing directly into the chest. The Haoran sword, which was disassembled by the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong, was like countless sharp swords, stabbing in Ning Ke's body, and poking out countless invisible holes. However, those holes quickly collapsed, leaving no passage at all. In order to forcibly poke through those blocked passages, Ning Ke made great efforts, and his spirit and body were seriously exhausted. He didn't faint again, but with more and more times of meditation and forcibly mobilizing psyche power to break the mountain, his face became paler and paler, his throat became drier and his ears began to buzz, and the pain in his chest and abdomen was enough to kill countless talents like Xia Qingyun. The injured lobe of his lungs began to affect his breathing, and his coughing at night became louder and more hoarse and unpleasant, so Sang Sang slept less and less. Finally, one morning, he spat out a mouthful of blood. After being sent to the medical hall, the doctor looked at the lad with pity as if he was looking at a tuberculosis patient, and then casually prescribed some nourishing medicine, and told him to take a good rest and not to go to the brothel again. After receiving 20 taels of silver, he didn't say anything more. After paying such a big price, the mountain in Ning Ke's body, the humble mountain, and the snow mountain were still there in silence. It was really like watching him dig the mountain, and the mountain collapsed, watching him move the mountain, and the mountain didn't speak a word of contempt. One night, Chen Pippi finally finished the learning task of the ancient ritual and sacrificial process arranged by second brother, and came to the old library in the starlight again. When he opened the thin book and saw the sonorous and powerful declaration left by Ning Ke, he was so shocked that he almost cried out. With his fat lips trembling, he pointed at the words left by Ning Ke, and angrily scolded in a low voice, "Are you really an idiot? In this world, except for the West Hill Divine Palace using the great god's vanquishing skill and asking the light of Haotian to forcefully open people's acupoints, who else can go against heaven and change fate? You actually want to open your own acupoints. You are so arrogant and stupid." Thinking of the long-lost Peach Mountain in West Hill, Chin Pippi was even more angry, and shouted, "3 great divine priests have to spend half of their lifetime to use the great god's vanquishing skill. Now who in this world is worth such a big price for the divine hall? You know, I was just fed a few heavenly power pills in those days." He felt sorry for Ning Ke's misfortune, and angry for his blind struggle. While angry, he waved the pen on the paper, and finished, "If one can open their acupoints easily, then everyone in this world is a cultivator. Idiot. 6 hours, 3,000 words, like sh*t. My brain has become an idiot. Fortunately, I have written it out. Tomorrow at the same time, I will try to move this mountain. The chapter name is not bad. By the way, I recommend the beans Poisonous Fairy. I am sh*t. Good night. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 105. Gently patting his cheeks and rubbing his hands, Ning Ke pulled himself together and went upstairs. After greeting the female teacher, he waved his hand to drive away the cicadas and took out the thin book from the bookshelf. Full of expectations, he looked at the new handwriting on the paper and could not help raising his eyebrows and feeling gratified. However, after a while, his eyebrows could not help but droop with some annoyance. The mysterious guy's message rudely and even coldly pierced all the hopes he had these days. It could even be said that the more he suffered, the more he felt that the door was right in front of him. It directly told him that no one in the world could enlighten the acupores by themselves, and all those who tried to do so were dead. Will people die? What about those guys from the Devil's Doctrine? Ning Ke muttered to himself with eyes full of disappointment. He thought to himself, since the gray-haired man said that everyone could be the god of cookery, why can't everyone be a cultivator? After a long silence, he finally decided to give up reading Wu Zhanyang's theory on Haoran's sword. Because of many reasons, Ning Ke could be strong and persevering to move the mountain, regardless of the difficulties and obstacles he might face. However, courage and perseverance were not the same as stubbornness and stone-like stubbornness. Although he still did not know who the mysterious message was and what his identity in the academy was, he firmly believed that the person must be a cultivation genius who had a far better understanding of cultivation than himself. Since the other party said that people would not die from forcibly enlightening the acupores, then it would be very dangerous for him to move the mountain blindly. A wise man is good enough to be my teacher, and it is wise to listen to others' advice. Ning Ke's rational thinking made him decide to temporarily stop using the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to break the characters, but he was still inevitably disappointed. Before leaving the old library, he could not help but write a paragraph with the brush pen and ink. I won't read it today, but I will continue to read it tomorrow. I am not reading the primary exploration of Ocean of Qi and Mountain of Snow now, but I am reading Wu Zhanyang's theory on Haoran's sword. You can leave me a message there. Besides, I have one last question. If most people in the world cannot sense the breath of heaven and earth because of different physiques, if this is the fate that Haotian gave to each of us, then isn't it too unfair for Lord Haotian? Late at night, Chin Pippi appeared in the old library again. He looked out the window at the dark night sky covered by clouds and took out the book and the piece of paper from the bookshelf. After reading it, he couldn't help but laugh angrily. His round chubby cheeks were full of resentment. He thought to himself that the tone of this kid's messages was getting more and more impolite. He obviously wanted something from him, but the tone of the message sounded like he was ordering him to do something. He really didn't know where this idiot came from. Although he was thinking this way, he panted and squatted down to pull out Wu Zhanyang's theory on Haoran's sword from the bottom of the bookshelf. Then he walked to the west window and began to reply to Ning Kei's message. As the most brilliant genius student in the academy in recent years, Chen Pippi could only attend classes and study under the pressure of those horrible senior brothers after he entered the second floor. He had no chance to play his hobby of being a teacher. That night when he saw Ning Kei's emotional message, he accidentally replied to it. He was concerned about it and wanted to see if the poor guy could make a breakthrough. He also wanted to satisfy himself. As the saying goes, helping people is also addictive. Chen Pippi did not know the name of the poor guy, whether he was a man or a woman, old or young, but since he had helped him from the beginning, it was like the mud in the wetland in front of the building. It was hard to get rid of once it got stuck to your hands. It was purely a psychological problem. The next day, Ning Kei went to the old library and directly took out the book of Haoran's sword. Then he saw the mysterious man's message and 2 lines of extremely arrogant words on the paper. He could not help but rub his eyebrows and smile bitterly. There is no such thing as fairness in this world. Lord Haotian is like the sunshine on the snow mountain. He will always pity the lotus above the clouds and is too lazy to look at the grass in the cracks of the rocks at the foot of the mountain. For example, I am the unique genius in the world. And you are a poor guy who can't cultivate because all the acupoints in your body are blocked. So what you, a grass, should do now is not to doubt all this, but to accept all this. Ning Kei took the thin paper and murmured, the unique genius in the world? What a cocky guy. He became more and more suspicious of the mysterious man's identity. Judging from the man's choice of words and sentences, he was not like those old and virtuous professors in the academy, but more like the precious orchids growing in the greenhouse since childhood like Mr. Xia and Zhong Dajuan. But this person was obviously several levels higher than Xie Qingyun and others, because when he said that he was a genius, his tone seemed to be so natural, like the absolute truth that had been proved countless times by the world and time. For example, water flowed to the bottom, the hot and sour noodle slice soup was delicious, and Sang Sang was hardworking. However, Ning Kei had never been willing to lag behind others when it came to self-confidence. He had never been arrogant in front of a crowd or among his classmates. That was because he believed that he had long passed that age and that it was inappropriate and childish for him to act like that. However, it did not mean that he had the slightest doubt about his own ability. Since childhood, he had been writing all over the school's double roll. From kindergarten's various interest classes to Olympiad math class, he had been invincible in the new China's education system. He was a freak and a good student. He absolutely believed that he was the real genius. So he answered in this way today. There's no need to argue about the lotus and grass, but what I want to say is that if there really is a unique genius in this world, then this genius can only be me, and not you, because only I have the qualifications to be that one and only one. In this case, I have another question. Since you said that Lord Haotian will only pity the real genius, and since I am the real genius, why can't I cultivate? The West Hill Divine Kingdom, which had the most believers, the most unworldly sublime beings, and the most wealth and power, naturally had many geniuses. In the depths of the ruined temple, in front of the 7 tomes of arcane, there were many geniuses. The Tang Academy, which had the most revered status in the world, had the most hermits, and had people like the headmaster of the academy, naturally had many geniuses. Behind several stone statues on the 2nd floor, there were many wise men who lived peacefully. Chen Pippi, who had just lived a short 16 years, had already studied in these 2 places for many years. From the attitude of his teachers and the eyes of his classmates, he had long confirmed that he was the most outstanding genius in the cultivation world. Even if he met the other 2 guys from the unknown place, he still had enough capital to be proud. So he did not think that his usual attitude and message to the guy was too proud, because it was just a simple statement of fact. Now he finally met a guy who was prouder and more confident than him. The problem was that in his opinion, the guy who claimed to be the one and only genius was just a pitiful person who didn't even know what cultivation was. He only had some perseverance and tricks. Well, Pippi admitted that the guy was smart and persistent, but what made him compete with him for the word genius? In his anger, he wrote wildly with the help of the dim starlight through the clouds and the angry cicadas outside the window. He gave Ning Ke a question in his message. You used the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong to break the characters and use such a stupid method to read the book and forget the meaning. I guess the sword aura must have hurt your heart and lungs when you read the Howren sword. Then let me ask you, how should you treat the heart and lungs? Don't talk about the dirty medicine such as Qian Saozi. I only ask you, how do you boil mugwort and mugwort? How many times do you boil the fire? How to deal with Angelica dehurica and ginkgo? Slice or grind? How to dose red ginseng and brown sugar? How to mix it? When is the green fruit and green wormwood tonic? You answer me. Mugwort and mugwort, Angelica dehurica and white fruit, red ginseng and brown sugar, green fruit and green wormwood? Ning Ke looked at the scribbled messages on the paper and imagined the look of the guy who should be very young when he wrote furiously. He could not help but raise his eyebrows and feel that this matter was really too interesting. It was not surprising that the guy left a question to test him. But he did not expect that the question left by the guy had nothing to do with the 6 subjects of cultivation, such as how many sword styles could be seen when the characters were broken down in the 8 strokes calligraphy of Yong. Instead, he asked about the way of medicine. In an instant, he understood the intention of the guy. The guy thought that he was a unique genius in cultivation, so it was naturally a little unfair to test him with questions about cultivation. Therefore, he simply chose a question that had nothing to do with the 6 subjects of cultivation. It was a question about how to choose and decoct medicine. The reason why the other party chose this question was very clear, and it was also very proud. The so-called genius was an all-rounder who was well-versed in every field. Using a cultivation question to test you doesn't count as a skill, but using the problems you encountered on your own will be enough to stump you to death. What a prideful fellow. Ning Ke smiled and shook his head, and then his smile suddenly disappeared. Because he really did not know how to solve this question and how to mix and decoct those familiar medicines to cure his lung injury. The doctor in Chang and City only told him to take good care of himself after receiving 20 taels of silver from Sang Sang. Although he was used to treating wounds with herbs in Min Mountain, he really did not know how to treat his lung injury and how to treat those medicines. Those who are not competitive usually disdain to be competitive. Have you ever seen the young Wang Bo argue with his peers about the different ways to write the Chinese characters? Have you ever seen Lin Jiying at the age of 17 compete with her classmates at the Huagang Art School for a man's affection? But if the young Wang Bo met Gan Luo, or the 17-year-old Lin Jiying met Sun Yaowei, now that Ning Ke met a proud guy who claimed to be a genius and was very likely to be a real genius, he naturally wanted to compete with him. But unfortunately, he really did not know how to answer this question. I really can't answer your question, he replied shamefully on the paper. Then he raised his eyebrows and the freckles on his face lit up. He tightened his right hand holding the brush and wrote on the paper, but to be fair, I also have a question for you. I don't know if you can answer it. 201110232330 modification, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 106. Under the starlight, there was a piece of paper, 2 pieces of paper, 3 pieces of paper on the table by the west window. Pippi's eyes widened as he looked at the densely packed small characters on the paper. He felt his scalp tingle and wondered what kind of title this was. There were actually 3 whole paragraphs of characters written on it. Subconsciously, he began to read from the beginning. Haotian's light shines on the world, and cares for all living creatures like a cattle herder. If you think you are a little smart, you can try to calculate the number of cattle herded by Haotian. The cattle gather in the Kaiping market in the north of the Tang Empire. They are divided into 4 groups and pass through the city gate to leisurely graze on the grassland of the barbarians. The first group is as white as silk, the second group is shining with black luster, the third group is brown and yellow, and the fourth group is colorful. There are males and females in each group, and there are many and few of them. Let me tell you the proportion of the bulls in each group. The number of white bulls is equal to the number of brown bulls, plus 1/3 and half of the number of black bulls. In addition, the number of black bulls is equal to 1/4 and 1/5 of the number of colorful bulls, plus all the brown bulls. When the brown bulls and colorful bulls are together, they form a triangle, and no bull dares to break in. Please tell me the exact number of cattle in each group, and add an explanation. I solved this question when I was 7 years old. In the following time, Chinpipi stared at the dense ink marks on the paper, and began to bite the pen, scratch his head and hair, smash his legs, pursed his lips, gasped, licked the pen tip, began to calculate, gave up, and then continued to bite the pen, scratch his head and hair, smash his legs, pursed his lips, gasped, and cursed in a low voice. He did not leave until late at night. The back mountain of the academy was shrouded in a faint mist in the early morning. The stone square was surrounded by a few thin fences, and one could faintly hear the sound of roosters pecking at their food nearby. Occasionally, there were some voices of reading and questioning coming from the school deep in the stone square. The fog gradually dispersed, and Chinpipi dragged his fat body out. His eyes were bloodshot after staring for a whole night, and his hair, which was usually tied up tightly, was fluffy and messy like a pile of grass pulled by a chicken. He looked extremely embarrassed, not like a poor child who had been scolded by his mother for a whole night, but more like a poor child who had been scolded by his mother with a stick. Chinpipi walked to the door of the school and listened to the questions being asked inside. Thinking of his usual arrogance, he couldn't help but feel ashamed. However, the urge to solve the question won over the possible humiliation. He gritted his teeth and pushed the door open. Without looking around, he respectfully bowed to the people around him. A moment later, a few shocked and mocking laughter rang out in the study room. There are actually math problems in this world that our junior brother doesn't understand? Even a genius like you can't solve this problem. How can we solve it? Pippi, don't be naughty. At this moment, a person appeared at the door of the study room, and the laughter in the room suddenly stopped. Everyone, including Chinpipi, quickly stood up and bowed respectfully, saying, "Greetings, second brother." The person who was addressed as second senior brother was tall, wearing a rather ancient hat and an ordinary summer uniform of the academy. However, there was a satin belt woven from golden threads tied around his waist. He had dashing eyebrows and handsome eyes, and his expression was solemn and square. His entire body exuded an air of strict observance of etiquette. Standing there, he seemed as unshakable as a palace. The season of the year is in spring. It's still the end of spring, and it's not summer yet. You're already lax again. The season of the year is in the morning. Now it's just morning, and you're already laughing and joking again. How improper. Everyone knew that second brother had such a proud and polite temperament, and they were even more nervous when facing him than when facing the headmaster of academy and eldest brother. Fortunately, they had long been used to such clichés, so they didn't take it seriously and just responded with a smile. Chinpipi couldn't pretend to be stupid. He smiled awkwardly, tidied up his messy scalp as fast as he could under the stern gaze of second brother, and pulled his wrinkled uniform hard. Then he coughed twice and walked forward, handing the pieces of paper in his hand to second brother very respectfully. "You got A+ in 6 subjects in the academy entrance exam, and there are math problems that you can't solve?" Second brother took the 3 pieces of paper with a slight frown and glanced at them. They said the same sentence, but it was not to laugh at Chinpipi, but to be a little confused. Who made the problem that embarrassed a genius like youngest brother to this extent? After quickly reading the problems on the paper, second brother frowned more and more, and his thin lips curled up. After a long while, he said, "This. Who made the damn problem? The algorithm is too troublesome, and I don't know how long it will take to figure it out. I'm going to study ancient rites these days, and I don't have time to play with you. You can figure it out yourself." After saying this, second brother flicked his sleeves, put his hands on the golden silk belt around his waist, and proudly turned to leave the study room. He went straight to the direction of the fog-shrouded fence outside the door. The study room was silent, and all the students looked at second brother's back in astonishment. They thought that second brother, who hid his absolute pride with seriousness, would also use this method to avoid a fight. Thinking of second brother's usual serious behavior, some people wanted to laugh, but immediately raised their hands to cover their mouths, for fear that second brother would hear their laughter. Chen Pippi looked at second brother's gradually disappearing back, and his expression became even uglier. His fat face twitched and undulated, and he ran to the door and cried, "Senior brother, you should at least give me some ideas." At this time, second brother slowly walked out of the stone platform with strict and square steps, like an emperor on the stage. Hearing Chen Pippi's pleading, he didn't look back, but raised his hand impatiently, and angrily rebuked, "I said I won't figure it out, so I won't. I don't know how big the number of this damn problem will be. Not to mention Kaiping Market, even the whole Tang Empire can't put down so many cows. I'm curious about where Haotian's ranch is. Well, I admit that I can't figure out this damn problem, but I don't believe you can, especially when you were 7 years old. Unless you tell me the answer immediately, I will think that you are acting shamelessly. To tell you the truth, acting shamelessly to me in the academy, especially to someone who is angry out of shame today, will cause very serious consequences. This is not a warning, but a friendly reminder." Next to the table by the west window, Ning Kei's right foot stepped on the chair, and his right arm rested on the windowsill, supporting his chin. He read that guy's message with great interest, and his eyebrows raised proudly from time to time. When he saw the 4 words, "angry out of shame," he couldn't help laughing out loud, which made the female professor by the east window frown and look at him. Ning Kei hurriedly sat up straight, and then continued to read that guy's message. He didn't know who was the person who was angry out of shame in the message, and thought that it was just an excuse to save face. If he knew that the person who was angered by his Archimedes ox-splitting problem was the legendary second brother of the second floor, he didn't know whether he would laugh more happily or break out in a cold sweat. As for the guy's accusation of acting shamelessly, Ning Kei didn't care at all. As a former problem-solving patient with Stockholm Syndrome, he knew very well the pain and annoyance of looking at a problem and not being able to find the answer. The guy's accusation was nothing more than an urgent need to know the answer. Do you want to know the answer to this problem? It's very simple. First tell me the answer to your medicine decoction problem, and then we will call this a draw. If you are not convinced, we can continue later. Outside the window, the spring scenery was in its last bloom, and the young cicadas were desperately chirping. Ning Kei shook his head and chuckled. He rolled up his sleeves, poured water into the pot, ground the ink, and put the brush on the inkstone. Then he wrote the above words on the paper. On the night of the second day, the horse carriage left the academy, passed through the Vermilion Bird Gate in the south of Chang'an, and drove to Lin 47th Street in the eastern city. It stopped in front of the old brush pen shop. Ning Kei turned around and thanked the coachman before walking into the shop. The shop door was closed, and Sang Sang came out with a bowl of hot and sour noodle slice soup left in the morning. She put it in front of Ning Kei along with chopsticks and a towel, and then took out a plate of vinegar-soaked cabbage head and a plate of cold mixed with 3 kinds of shredded vegetables from under the table. After studying hard in the academy for a whole day, Ning Kei had to eat leftovers and pickled vegetables at home. He thought to himself, anyway, we are people with 2,000 taels of silver. How can we treat ourselves so harshly? If it were any other day, he might have directly taught the little handmaiden a lesson. However, he was in a good mood today, so he just shook his head and picked up the chopsticks to eat with relish. He also asked a few questions about the shop's business today. Sang Sang had already eaten in the afternoon, and now she was sitting beside him. Her thin arms were placed on the table, and her dark little face was resting on her arms. She tilted her head and stared at Ning Kei's face with her willowy eyes. After a while, she asked curiously, "Young master, are you in a good mood today?" "Yes." Ning Kei picked up a piece of blackened cabbage head and threw it into his mouth. He chewed it and frowned painfully because of the sour taste. He answered vaguely, recently, I met a very interesting guy in the academy. Sang Sang heard that he had made a new friend in the academy and smiled happily. She tilted her little face and asked with concern, is it a classmate? Is it a man or a woman? Ning Ke looked at the little handmaiden's face and was slightly startled. He moved the tip of his chopsticks in the warm hot and sour noodle slice soup. After a while, he hesitated and said, I haven't seen him before, but, he should be a man? No. Thinking of the obscene metaphor the first time he left the message, he shook his head and said resolutely, it shouldn't be. That guy must be a man, and he must be a wretched man who has suffered many times at the hands of women. Wretched and wretched. Sang Sang began to think and wrinkled her nose. They don't seem to be the same thing. Wretched is his experience, wretched is his temperament. Ning Ke explained seriously. Sang Sang sat up and asked curiously, does it mean that he is ugly? As I said just now, I haven't seen him. Ning Ke took out a piece of paper from his arms and handed it to her. He said, there are several herbs on the paper, as well as the method of decocting and cutting them. Go to the pharmacy tomorrow to get the herbs, and then come back to fix it yourself. Remember, don't let others see it. Sang Sang took it and asked with a frown, why can't others see it? Ning Ke thought of the guy who left him a message in the old library and couldn't help laughing. He said, if I am right, that guy should be a student of the second floor of the academy. This prescription must be an exquisite secret prescription from the second floor. Since you and I have secretly taken advantage of that guy, it is better not to let others know. Note, this question is about Archimedes dividing the cow. Because it is too long, I can't write it all out. If I did, it would be too easy for me to write this chapter. Haha. You can find out by searching on Google. My understanding of mathematics is just like Ning Ke's understanding of cultivation. There are many things that I don't understand. If there are any problems, and if there are students who study mathematics, you can just release me like that kind of gas. This is also the first disclaimer of Jiang Yi. 201110232441 revised, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 107. People were coming and going downstairs of the old library, but it was quiet upstairs as usual. The books on the shelves were old thread-bound cultivation books, and the thin paper used by academy students was common. A brush, ink, and an inkstone were quietly placed on the table by the west window. The female professor sat quietly under the east window, and the lad sat cross-legged on the floor, thinking hard. Occasionally, he would get up and write a few sentences on the paper, and then put them into the book. At night, another fat lad came quietly, and after seeing the messages, he would go to the west window and write a few sentences or a long speech. Ning Ke and Chin Pippi, who did not know each other's identity, kept communicating by leaving notes. The late spring and early summer quietly slipped away as they rode and laughed. It was peaceful and beautiful. Brother John Doe, is there any way to make the sword style in the book more gentle? Idiot, if it could be gentle, how could it be called sword style? Besides, the math question about the meadow and the cow yesterday was too weird. What is the relationship between quantity? Idiot, don't call everything you don't understand weird. Besides, is there really no way to open the acupoints? I still don't believe that Master Haotian would be so unfair to a genius like me. There is indeed, but you still shouldn't have any hope. There is only a fine line between a genius and an idiot. Anyone who has such hope, whether he is a genius or not, will become a poor idiot in the end. Besides, I still have to repeat that the math question you asked the day before yesterday was really a bit weird. It was not simple and beautiful. I heard that the devil's doctrine used a different method. They did not seek to resonate with the breath of heaven and earth, but tried to absorb the breath of heaven and earth into the body. There are no acupoints in the body. Can you use this method to step into the path of cultivation? Besides, Here is the third math question I gave you. Please try to solve it seriously, and don't always ask for the answer from me. This question is just for beginners. Are you trying to humiliate me? As for the devil's doctrine, I have to warn you. It's okay in the academy, but don't mention it outside. Otherwise, you'll be chased by all the righteous powerhouses in the world. Besides, I have to tell you with a smile that even the devil's doctrine's cultivation method of absorbing heaven and earth into one's body requires all the acupoints to be connected. Only then can the breath of heaven and earth flow into one's body. This is really regrettable. I thought there would be other paths to take. You can think of using the 8 strokes of calligraphy of Yong to solve the characters. You are also a guy who takes an unconventional approach. I am really worried that you will be forced to cultivate the devil's path. So you should not feel sorry, but feel lucky. Otherwise, if you fall into the devil's path, maybe I may have to cut you into 3 halves with my sword in the future. You're right. I feel very disappointed. By the way, we are considered pen pals, right? Why don't you ever ask me who I am? Aren't you curious at all? Don't you think it's a great opportunity to get to know this genius? I have never been curious about other people's affairs. Besides, you have never asked me who I am. Well, who are you? Where are you from? Which dormitory in the academy? Do you have any beautiful sisters at home? My name is Ning Quebec. I come from the city of Wei, classroom 3 of the academy. There is only a little black handmaiden at home. Who are you? Where are you from? You already have a fierce wife and concubine at home. Is that why you hate women so much? My name is Chin Pippi. I come from West Hill. Then, that's it. I heard that a candidate from West Hill got an A+ in 6 subjects 5 years ago. All the instructors of the academy came out to watch, because that was the best result in 100 years. Is that person you? Yes, it is. Do you have a feeling of awe and admiration for me now? I got 3 A+ in 3 subjects, 2 D+ in 2 subjects, and 1 abandoned. It is said that it is also a unique result in the academy in 100 years. In that case, why should I admire you? It's easy to get 3 A+ in 3 subjects. You can get 2 D+ in 2 subjects, and 1 abandoned. It is really a rare and fierce level. You win. I temporarily admit that you are qualified to talk to me as an equal. You are from West Hill. Why did you come to the Tang Empire to study? I come from a big family in West Hill. You can't imagine how big the family business is. You know, a genius like me is destined to inherit the family property when I was born, but the problem is that I have an equally talented elder brother who is just a little bit inferior to me. More importantly, this elder brother has been treating me extremely well since I was very young, taking care of me and doting on me in everything. He has never complained about the elders of the clan deciding to let me inherit the family property. I didn't want to inherit the family business at all. I thought my brother was the best candidate to inherit the family business. But the elders in the family didn't allow me to refuse. The longer I stayed in the West Hill, the better my brother treated me, and the more uncomfortable I felt. So I sneaked out when I was 10 years old. Sneaked out when you were 10 years old. Didn't your elders look for you everywhere? How could they not? Since they couldn't find me, they must have guessed that I was hiding in the academy. What about you? Why did you enter the academy? Why did you work so hard a few days ago? I entered the academy because I wanted to be an official of the empire. Of course, I wanted to cultivate more. As for why I worked so hard, it was because I had a lot of things to do. If I didn't work hard now, I might lose my life in the future. What could be so troublesome? That's because I can't tell you the story, you know. They exchanged notes on the paper beside the west window of the old library. At the beginning, they asked each other about cultivation and mathematics. Gradually, they became curious about each other's lives. As time passed, Ning K, who had used the prescription, quickly recovered and stopped coughing. The 2 young people, who had never met each other, became more and more familiar with each other. As the summer approached, the temperature became higher and higher. The west window had been closed, shrouding the building in darkness. Ning Ke looked at the notes left by that guy these days, and the smile on his face gradually disappeared. He found a shocking detail. That guy called Shin Pippi said that if his family couldn't find him, they must have guessed that he was hiding in the academy. This indirectly indicated that there was no place in the world that the guy's family couldn't find. Only a sacred and remote place like the academy could make that family afraid. In the West Hill Divine Kingdom, how could there be such a powerful family? He frowned slightly and thought for a moment, but still couldn't figure it out. Then he continued to read. Yesterday afternoon, he had asked if they could meet in the letter for the first time. Now that he was sure that Shin Pippi was on the second floor, he was naturally curious about the reply in the letter. On the paper was someone's handwriting from last night. When you can enter the second floor, you will naturally see me. Ning Ke shook his head and replied with his pen, the problem is, how can I enter the second floor? Hao Tian's unfairness had blocked all the acupoints in the young lad's body. No matter how he tried to read books in a deconstructive way, or to move mountains and dig holes with a fearless spirit, he had never really taken a step forward on the road of cultivation. At this time, looking at the words, second floor, he inevitably felt a little sad. He put down his pen and stood up to look at the quiet bookshelves around him. He laughed at himself and sighed softly, thinking that it was really interesting and boring to stand on the second floor and think about where the second floor was. Suddenly, he frowned slightly. He noticed that there was a shallow scratch on the ground below the bookshelf that was leaning against the mountain wall not far away. The scratch on the dark-colored wooden floor was extremely faint. If one did not look carefully, it would be hard to notice. After a moment of silence, Ning Ke walked over and squatted down to touch it with his fingers, confirming that it should be the result of years of friction. He looked up at the heavy bookshelf, and his fingers that were pressing on the scratch slightly trembled. On both sides of the bookshelf, there were some complicated patterns that were difficult to understand. The patterns were greasy over the years, suddenly round and suddenly square without any specific shape, looking extremely ugly. Every detail of the flying eaves and carved rafters of the old library was extremely exquisite, but the patterns on the bookshelf facing the wall were so crude. He felt more and more strange. He slowly touched it with his fingers, and then closed his eyes to feel every kind of touch coming from his fingers. Could it be that the legendary second floor was behind the bookshelf? Could it be that the Real Academy was behind the wall? You can try to pry open the bookshelf and see what is behind it. Ning Ke suddenly opened his eyes and turned around. He found that the gentle and small female professor had quietly come behind him and was looking at him with a gentle and even a little encouraging eyes. He didn't know the real meaning of the gentle and quiet eyes of the female professor. He glanced at the patterns on the bookshelf with a bitter smile. Occasionally, something flashed in his mind. He remembered how he felt when he saw the vermilion bird on the Vermilion Bird Avenue and when he saw the animals on the eaves in the palace. He vaguely guessed something and dared not to do anything disrespectful. It was now midsummer in the 13th year of the Tianqi era. Ning Ke and Sang Sang had been in the magnificent city of Chang'an for several months. They opened the old brush pen shop and successfully entered the academy to study. They ate leftovers every day, as if nothing had changed in their lives. But in fact, it was not so. The young soldier from the border town followed someone to fight for a night in the spring rain. He entered the palace once and fought hard with those cultivation classics in the old library for several days and nights. He saw a bigger and more magnificent world and got to know some interesting people. Both his vision and spirit were much different from before. Most importantly, in these few months, he had sent away his first friend, killed the censor Zhang Yiqi and Chen Zixian, and taken the first step on the path of revenge. Fortunately, the death of these two people did not seem to have alerted the Tang Empire's officials and the powerful General Xiahou. It's too hot. That's the bad thing about Chang'an. Lying on the bamboo chair and looking at the stars above, Ning Ke wiped the sweat off his face and shook his head. He said, the weather will only be cooler in the morning. There is a small lake beside the tea specialist's house. Do you think it will be more comfortable than here? Sang Sang took the towel and soaked it in the bucket of cold water. She said in a low voice, Young master, are you going to kill him just because his house is cooler? Revenge, is it really that interesting? 201110232250 revised. 3 chapters have been written. 3 chapters have been revised. Please vote for me. I've just started moving the mountain, and I really need everyone's help to stimulate me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 108. Chang'an was a city that had no regrets, except for its summer. In June, the sun was getting brighter and brighter, and the temperature was getting higher and higher. The hot summer air enveloped the streets and alleys. Occasionally, the wind would blow with a disgusting warm breath, wilting the originally green and plump leaves, staining the grapes on the racks purple, bringing out the ice cubes from the houses of the nobles, and pushing open the doors and windows of the commoners. All the doors and windows of the shops along the street of Lin 47th Street were open. Compared to the risk of theft, the risk of dying from heat stroke was obviously more terrifying. The poor manservants and waiters sat on the stone steps and looked around weakly, guarding against the thieves who had also stayed at home to enjoy the cool air. The shopkeepers and the masters moved bamboo chairs and water buckets to an alley behind the street. The alleys were quiet and narrow, shaded by green pagoda trees. There was not much sunlight during the day, and the night wind was much faster because of the narrow alleys, which made people feel relatively cool when it blew on them. All kinds of bamboo beds and small square tables had completely blocked the narrow alleys behind the street. The neighbors were lying on the bamboo beds and chatting lazily, with fruits soaked in well water on the small square tables beside them. There were also those who were used to finding joy in bitterness. They dug into their bowls of oily noodles, the sweat from the chili mixed with the sweat from the stuffy heat. They used the trick of fighting poison with poison to deceive themselves that the night was not that unbearably hot. From time to time, there would be a clear smack in the alleys. It sounded like an adult was educating a naughty child, but in fact, it was just people patting their greasy and sweaty backs with towels soaked in well water. You can't. Do you still want to find someone to warm your feet on such a hot day? The couple in the fake antique shop argued day after day about taking a concubine. The people on Lin 47th Street had long been tired of hearing it, and even began to wonder if it was a kind of flirtation. There was also a back door at the back street of the old brush pen shop. It had not been used for a few days, but now it was finally put to use. Ning Ke lay on the bamboo chair and took the wet towel from Sang Sang. He sighed and wiped his naked upper body. Listening to the quarrel coming from the bamboo bed next door, he thought that the life of the common people was not as interesting as what scholars said. Since it was boring, he decided to leave. He put the wet towel on his shoulder, got up and said goodbye to his neighbors before returning to his own courtyard. Sang Sang followed him with a bucket in one hand and a bamboo recliner in the other. Today, the little handmaiden was wearing a thin blue floral blouse. Her arms and legs were bare, and her tanned face was flushed. Her body was too cold to sweat, but it did not mean that she could not feel the heat inside and outside the eaves. On the contrary, it made her feel more annoyed. She looked at Ning Ke by the well and asked, "Young master, can I take off my outer blouse?" Ning Ke fetched a bucket of fresh cold water from the well and was about to pour it on his head to get rid of the annoying heat. Suddenly, he heard her words and could not help but feel more annoyed. He turned his back and lectured her, "Although you are young, you are still a girl. How can you take off your clothes in front of a man? You are not 3 or 4 years old anymore. I can wipe your body and take a bath for you. You are about to become a big girl. Wake up, will you?" Sang Sang stared at him angrily and asked, "Young master, you didn't answer me just now. Is revenge really so interesting?" killing one every few days? Don't you find it boring? This is an interesting and irrelevant thing, Ning Ke replied. We are eating leftovers every day. We have to go to the toilet every day. Isn't it boring and repetitive? But you still have to do it. Because if you don't eat, you will starve to death. If you don't poop, you will suffocate to death. Killing for revenge is boring, but in order to live in peace, no matter how boring it is, you still have to kill. After saying this, he raised his hands and flipped them over. The entire bucket of slightly cold well water splashed onto his body, and then poured onto the stone floor of the small courtyard. His spirit was immediately refreshed, and then he found that his lower body was slightly cold. He looked down in surprise, and saw that the cotton shorts he was wearing had actually been washed down by a section. Sang Sang looked at his exposed buttocks and the tight trousers around his buttocks. She giggled, which was rare for her. She covered her mouth with her small hands, but she couldn't hide her joy. Ning Ke lifted the shorts and turned back to scold her angrily. What are you looking at? Killing is more interesting than this. Sang Sang put down her little hand and looked at him seriously. She replied, I will make a bowl of fat intestine noodles later. In summer, it was the darkest and coolest time in Chang'an City before dawn. The residents who were forced to lie on the street by the hot night returned to their beds. They took advantage of this short period of coolness to have the most wonderful and deep sleep, trying to make up for all the time lost in the summer. No one slept in the old brush pen shop. Sang Sang made a bowl of fragrant noodle soup with a lot of chives, 6 or 7 pieces of fat intestine and 2 pieces of large intestine. Ning Ke ate the noodle soup like a whirlwind. He wiped his mouth and put on a shabby ordinary outer shirt and a brand new ordinary bamboo hat. He covered most of his face with a mask and wrapped the padao and the big black umbrella with a coarse cloth. Then, he pushed open the back door of the small courtyard and walked into the night after saying goodbye to the little handmaiden. Walking through the quiet streets and alleys of the eastern city, the cool night wind passed through them. Whether it was the tired residents or the vigilant dogs, they were all sleeping sweetly. It seemed that the whole city had not woken up yet. Only the sound of the water delivery cart rolling over the bluestone could be heard from time to time, and then it gradually faded away. The faint light of the lantern illuminated the road ahead of the water delivery cart, which was swaying restlessly. When the water delivery cart passed by the side entrance of a marketplace in the southern city, Ning Ke, who had been silently squatting in the gap of the big bucket, jumped down. His feet landed on the ground silently and his body quickly flashed into the darkness of the side alley of the marketplace. Then, he took out the hand-drawn map by Sang Sang and looked at it for the last time in the extremely dim light. Just as Sang Sang was puzzled, planning to kill a person every once in a while was totally incompatible with the quiet and bitter life of studying in the academy and the noisy and annoying life in the marketplace on Lin 47th Street. Moreover, this kind of boring repetition was really boring. But for Ning Ke, who had just returned to Chang'an from the city of Wei, eating a bowl of noodles with fat intestines or noodles with fried eggs from time to time and then killing people for revenge was like writing a few pieces of calligraphy and meditating for a few hours. It had become a very important part of his life and even a kind of habit. Every time he killed a target for revenge, every time he erased a name on the oil paper list, he would feel that the burden on his shoulders was reduced, his body was relaxed, and the sticky blood on his hands was a little lighter. Everyone instinctively yearned for a relaxed and happy life, so his instinct urged him to continue doing it. Sang Sang had prepared the knife, the cloth mask, the coat, the bamboo hat, the map and the target's living habits and schedule. A little black-faced handmaiden walking through the streets of Chang'an would not attract anyone's attention. Ning Ke was not worried about her safety, but trusted her ability. Therefore, every time he was about to unsheath his knife, he never thought that he would not be able to cut off a head, including today. When he quietly entered the marketplace under the cover of the night and walked toward the small lake behind the tea house, he had already begun to use that person's head as a sacrifice to the general's mansion and many people in the village. Today, he was going to erase the third name on the oil paper list. The owner of that head was Yen Suqing, 41 years old, a former document appraiser of the military ministry. He was good at tea ceremony and seal appraisal. After being driven out of the military ministry by the imperial court with an excuse, he became a tea master specially hired by a famous tea merchant in Chang'an. According to Zhuo Er's investigation, the irrefutable evidence that Xianwei general was accused of treason and colluding with the enemy was personally appraised by this person, and it was even possible that the 3 letters were forged by this person. This person also had a lot of unclear connections with the massacre of the village in the Yan territory. When Xiao's army pointed at the Yan kingdom, but failed to arrive at the edge of Min Mountain, Yen Suqing was in Xiao's army. But it was puzzling why, as a document appraiser of the military ministry, he would appear on the frontline battlefield full of killing and blood. Yen Suqing was now living in a lakeside house purchased for him by a tea merchant. Ning Ke walked along the lakeside quietly. Looking at the row of secluded houses on the lakeside getting closer and closer, as well as the bamboo walls and thatched cottages that seemed to be alienated but with a hint of antiquity, Ning Ke slowly raised his eyebrows outside the mask and suddenly felt something wrong. Because this lakeside house was too quiet and secluded. It was not easy to live in Chang'an. It could be said that every inch of land was worth its weight in gold. In the bustling city, the word quiet and secluded represented nobility, and it was very expensive. Ning Ke knew that Yen Suqing was deeply trusted and relied on by the tea merchant, but he believed that no matter how extravagant and generous a tycoon was, it was impossible for him to give such a lakeside house to his subordinate tea master. The morning light still hadn't arrived, and the view of the lakeside was still dark. Only the ripples of the water reflected the lights of some unknown houses, giving a faint light. Ning Ke walked to the front of the lakeside house, looking at the huge stone chair under the stone steps in the courtyard and the emaciated middle-aged man sitting in the chair through the alienated bamboo wall. After a slight pause, he pushed the door and entered. A small oil lamp was lit, and the emaciated middle-aged man sat on the stone chair, holding a coarse big mud-made teacup in his left hand, and gently knocking the corner of the ebony tea table with his right hand. He calmly looked at the lad who pushed the door and entered, and a faint smile suddenly appeared on his thin cheeks, and then he said softly, "The so-called tea ceremony is actually to strengthen a certain sense of ceremony with a complicated process, so as to produce a sense of solemnity. Many people think that when I drink tea at home, I must burn incense, take a bath, worship Haotian for a long time, and then wash the cup in the sea and play with it silently for a while before I can send the tea to my mouth. In fact, what I like most in my life is holding a big teacup and drinking tea. Maybe it's a habit developed in the army, and I prefer to be straightforward. On such a hot summer night, lad, you are restlessly sleeping in the house, but strolling by the lake. Presumably, you are here to kill me. Abstain from anger and anger. If you can't, close yourself and write quietly. Today I write very slowly and painstakingly, but this chapter is published after revision. There are still 2 more chapters, and I will continue to write slowly and seriously. Finally, I say, well, I won't say it, see you later. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for recommendation or monthly vote. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 109. The lakeside house under the shade of the bamboo wall was quiet and dark. The middle-aged tea artist was sitting on a stone chair carved with Kuan Lake stone, and in front of him was a tea table carved with Kuan Lake stone, on which there was an ebony tea table, on which there were warm and clean teapots and teacups. Beside the table was a small portable charcoal stove, on which the kettle on the stove exuded faint steam, but it had not boiled yet. In such a hot summer night, the middle-aged tea artist seemed not to feel the heat brought by the small charcoal stove. He was draped in a thin coat, and was as calm as a hospitable host waiting for someone to return in a winter snowy night. He was Yen Suqing. Ning Ke was very sure of this. The vigilance he had before outside the lakeside house was finally confirmed at this moment, because the other party had sensed his coming in advance, and had already perceived his intention. glancing at the tea dregs under the bamboo wall with the corner of his eyes, and after a moment of silence, he looked at the tea artist in the chair and asked, "Then let's be direct. I want to know whether you have anything to do with the extermination of the whole family of the Xianwei general's mansion and the massacre of the Yan border village?" Yan Suqing slightly frowned. He did not expect that the lad who came to kill him tonight was actually because of the two things many years ago. He had thought that no one in the world remembered those old things. After a moment of silence, he smiled and said, "Of course it has something to do with me. Otherwise, how could I, an officer with a bright future in the military ministry, become a tea artist who looks after the house of a tea merchant? I should not be the first person you've come to." He looked at Ning Kei and asked, "How are the others now? I haven't seen them for many years. I don't know what they are doing now." Ning Kei silently observed the lakeside house and the movements around. Looking at this noble residence, he answered, "They are not living well, at least not as good as you, who can live in such a nice place." Yan Suqing laughed out, shook his head and said with emotion, "Do you know why they are all not doing well, but I can live well? Because I am still of some use to the empire." The messy clothes on the body, the unboiled water on the small charcoal stove, and the empty teacup in his left hand all indicated that the tea specialist had just woken up. He probably got up because he sensed that Ning Kei was near the lakeside house. He was not planning to ambush Ning Kei in advance. He was just a tea artisan who looked weak and frail and dealt with tea sets and spring water all day long. Why didn't he call for help or run away when he knew that someone was coming to kill him? Instead, he just sat there calmly and waited. What could he rely on? Moreover, what use could a tea master have for the empire? How could a tea master guard a tea merchant's house? How could a tea master have a better retirement life than Chen Zixin? In the blink of an eye, Ning Kei thought of many possibilities, even the most impossible one. An unprecedented solemn expression appeared on his childish face outside the mask. He looked at the other party and asked, "Why didn't you escape? Why should I run?" Yan Suqing looked at the teenager with a smile and said, "Since I'm awake, how could you kill me?" After saying this, he gently flicked his sleeves, and a small dark sword without a handle appeared on the stone table. Ning Kei frowned and his body became a little stiff. He knew that he had encountered the most impossible possibility. This weak and frail tea artisan was actually a cultivator. At this moment, he could not help thinking of the conversation he had with Liu Qingchen on the journey. The conversation about sword masters and psyche masters in Cheng and City were as numerous as dogs. At that time, Liu Qingchen laughed and said that this argument was absolutely too exaggerated. After entering Cheng and City, Ning Kei had seen cultivators from the South School of Haotian Taoism opening altars and casting spells by the roadside, and had fought with cultivators in Spring Breeze Pavilion with Chao Xiaoshu. However, he really did not expect that an inconspicuous name on the revenge list was actually a powerhouse in that world. Neither Zhua Er's information nor Sang Sang noticed it. No one could imagine that the former document appraiser of the military ministry and the tea artisan supported by the tea merchants was actually a cultivator who was proficient in sword riding. Ning Kei's tightly knitted eyebrows slowly relaxed. He looked at Yan Suqing in the chair and the hiltless small sword in front of the emaciated middle-aged man, and said with a gentle smile, "Since you don't want to escape, I will." As soon as he finished his words, he turned around without hesitation and rushed out of the lakeside house like a galloping horse. Yan Suqing looked at the back of the teenager that was about to disappear beside the bamboo wall with great interest. He chuckled and shook his head, saying with emotion, "Since I've come to kill a cultivator, can I still retreat?" The gentle words with strong confidence and killing intent slowly came out from the thin middle-aged man's lips. At the same time, he put down the coarse big teacup in his left hand, rolled up the cuff on his left arm with his right hand, and made a sword formula with the middle and index fingers of his left hand, pointing obliquely to the outside of the lakeside house. His movement was extremely casual and unrestrained. As he pointed obliquely with the middle and index fingers, the dim hiltless small sword on the tea table suddenly hummed in a low voice, as if it was injected with some kind of magical energy. It suddenly bounced up from the table and then turned into a dark trace of light, tearing the darkest night before dawn of the lakeside house and piercing the outside of the courtyard. Ning Ke felt a prickling pain on his back, but there was no panic on his face, which was not covered by the mask. There was only calmness and calmness. Just as he was about to rush out of the sea of bamboos, he unexpectedly stomped on the ground with his left foot. His whole body turned over, and then his right foot stepped on the thick bamboo like lightning. Thump. 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 The solid soles of his shoes stepped on the bamboo rapidly, making the bamboo tree shake for a while, and countless bamboo leaves rustled down like broken feather arrows. He stepped on the bamboo tree and climbed to the courtyard wall in an instant, narrowly avoiding the sword light coming from the courtyard. Then he slightly bent his knees and quickly swept to the courtyard with the help of the vibration of the bamboo tree. With a bang, his body just swept over the courtyard wall like a sharp arrow, and the sharp padao had already been unsheathed in his hand. With a muffled groan, Ning Ke exerted strength in his waist and abdomen, turned over his wrist, and then the padao chopped toward Yen Suching like a snowstorm. Since he knew that this tea specialist was a powerful cultivator, he knew that tonight he would inevitably face a terrible test of life and death again. He knew that his present strength was not enough to fight against a powerful cultivator in the cultivation world, but he still didn't think of retreating, because he knew that retreating in the face of a cultivator meant death. At the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, he saw how Peng Yutao and the most elite bodyguards of the Tang Empire fought with a great sword master with iron and blood, will and discipline. Outside Spring Breeze Pavilion, he saw how Chao Xiaoshu beheaded 2 foreign cultivators with his superb strength and strong control, from which he learned some experience, that was, facing a cultivator, one could only advance and not retreat, and this experience might help him escape death. So at the beginning, his retreat was not retreat, but retreat in order to advance. And then kill. Ding! A clear sound was heard. Ning Ke twisted his body and waved his padao, chopping away the gray sword light that escaped behind him, and then his body fell from the air. For the first time they met, there was a rice grain-sized gap on the edge of the padao and a tiny tear on the top of his shabby robe. However, there was still no fear in his eyebrows and eyes outside the mask. His legs were firmly rooted on the ground like 2 nails, his hands tightly grasping the long hilt of the padao, and he slightly lowered his head to vigilantly observe the movement in the night. All of a sudden, he turned the long padao in his hand and avoided the sword light coming from the right side of the night at the cost of a blood mark on his left shoulder. At the same time, he confirmed from the slight vibration coming from his hand that his blade had at least scratched the flying sword. Ning Ke still slightly lowered his head, quietly staring at Yen Suching sitting in a chair not far away, and carefully listening to the slight buzzing sound in the night around the lakeside house from time to time, trying to determine the position of the flying sword. He took a step forward. A falling bamboo leaf outside the courtyard was torn into 2 halves by an invisible force. He fell backward like a mountain, and the gray shadow of the sword brushed past his shoulder, but it missed its target. He heavily patted the ground with his right hand, tightened his waist and abdomen, and then stood up again like a mountain. His feet moved as fast as lightning, and the gray sword shadow plunged into the crack of the flagstone in front of his feet, and then quickly flew away again with a buzzing sound, disappearing without a trace. He now stood 3 steps back from the previous position. The small oil lamp on the right side of the tea table glowed faintly, and Yen Suching sat in a stone chair with a faint smile. The distance between the two was only a few steps, but it was so difficult to cross this distance in the night. Because no one knew where the gray sword shadow was in the night. Holding the long padao hilt tightly with both hands, Ning Ke steadily stepped on the flagstone without stepping on the crack or the protrusion to ensure that he could borrow all the strength of the earth at any time. Like a statue, Ning Ke stared at the tea artist in the chair, with no fear in his eyes, only calmness and concentration. This was the first time in his life that he fought with a cultivator alone. He knew he had no chance, and he was very likely to meet death tonight, so of course he was afraid. But Ning Ke had been tortured by life and death too many times, so he was very clear that fear was the most useless emotion at this time. Only by turning fear and tension into excitement could he turn life and death around. The flying sword buzzed and stabbed at him like lightning. He waved his padao to cut it, and even if he missed, he would avoid the vital parts at the last moment by virtue of the fighting instinct honed on the battlefield and his extremely strong body control. Ding! 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 The sword was like flying light, and the padao was like snow. His body was cut with numerous dense wounds by the sword's shadow, and the blood seeped through his shabby clothes and began to drip on the surface of his body, making him look like a bloody man. But Ning Kai still held the padao tightly with both hands, and his feet were like nails on the flagstone. He stared at the powerhouse in the chair without any expression in his eyes, without panic or fear, and even without the fanaticism that should be in a desperate fight. A soldier coming back from the frontier fortress? Yan Suqing gradually stopped smiling, and looked at the bloody lad not far away from him, saying calmly, 14 consecutive sword attacks failed to directly stab you to death, and only left some small wounds on you. Only the frontier fortress soldiers have this kind of physical instinct. But I have to remind you that even if the wounds are small and the blood flow is slow, you will still die after a long time of bleeding. I understand, so I will try to find a chance to cut off your head before the blood runs dry. Ning Kai answered. You won't have such a chance. Yan Suqing looked at Ning Kai sympathetically and shook his head. At this time, the water on the small charcoal stove finally began to boil, and hot water mist sprayed from the mouth of the pot. The tea artist lifted the kettle on the stove with his left hand, and poured the water into the crude teacup. He looked at the tea leaves that kept floating in the boiling water, and lowered his head, saying, I'm going to drink the morning tea, so I won't play with you. There is one more chapter, which is being written. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote monthly. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 110. In the border town, on the journey, in the old brush pen shop and in many other places, Ning Kai had told Sang Sang many times that even if he couldn't cultivate, he could still chop them into pieces after he mastered the bladesmanship. But at least for now, this seemingly sonorous and forceful declaration could only be spiritual comfort or spiritual stimulation to a large extent. He knew how incredible the powerhouses in the cultivation world were. He had never expected to defeat a cultivator in a face-to-face battle, not to mention the sword master in front of him who had at least stepped into the no-doubt state. This was his first battle with a cultivator. He only had some indirect experience, so he didn't hold much hope. But he wouldn't despair, either. He always believed that only the dead needed despair. The water on the charcoal stove gradually boiled, and the steam rose. The boiling water rushed into the teacup. Ning Kai looked at this scene carefully, staring at Yan Suqing's every move, his shoulder, and his hand. He didn't listen to any words that might weaken his fighting will. When he saw this person pour tea, his eyes suddenly brightened. Since he had to hold the teacup, he naturally couldn't pinch the sword formula anymore. Ning Kai tightened his legs that were as firm as nails on the ground, and his body suddenly fell forward. Dragging the long padao with both hands, he rushed forward with all his strength. Feeling the strong wind blowing on his face and looking at the young soldier dragging the padao behind him, Yan Suqing showed a mixture of pity and sarcasm in his eyes. He stretched his right hand out of the cuff and spread his fingers in the night wind. There was a loud sound of wind breaking in the lakeside house. It was not the airflow caused by Ning Kai's pouncing body, but the sound of the deep night being torn apart by some kind of power. The dark sword shadow that had disappeared at some unknown place buzzed loudly. It seemed to be in front and suddenly behind, and its position was unpredictable. In an instant, it tore the night and stabbed at Ning Kai's back like lightning. The bamboo leaves rolled up by the wind on the bamboo wall suddenly became quiet, and then scattered in all directions in panic. The hot mist near the charcoal stove suddenly condensed, and then sank to the ground extremely slowly. The time on the stone ground in the courtyard seemed to become much slower. Was this the power of a sword master's full blow? Feeling the absolute coldness coming from his back and the sharpness that had already begun to break his heart even before he came into contact with it, Ning Ke sighed with emotion. He knew that the hand of the Grim Reaper was about to touch his back. However, he did not look back, nor did he dodge. He continued to charge forward like a ferocious tiger. He was still running because he knew that there was no way back if he looked back. Dodging at such a close distance would be futile. At this moment, he could only run towards death or run faster than death. Only in this way could he have the last shred of hope. When Ning Ke was 2 steps away from Yen Suqing, he stared at his opponent's neck with his eyes wide open, regardless of the aura of death so close to him. Crossing his hands, he concentrated all his strength on the pedao and fiercely chopped at Yen Suqing. Looking at the fierce blade light coming at his face, Yen Suqing held the teacup in his left hand and just touched his lips, with no expression on his face. In the sea of breath of nature, he clearly saw that the hiltless small sword controlled by his psyche power had already flown to the back of Ning Ke like lightning. Before the blade fell, the lad would die. The pedao in Ning Ke's hand was 3 feet away from Yen Suqing's neck. Yen Suqing's flying sword was 1 foot away from Ning Ke's back. The flying sword controlled by a cultivator was faster than the knife wielded by the best machete men in the world. No matter how he calculated, although Ning Ke bravely fought for a desperate chance, it was a pity that this last fight could only cost his own life, but could not hurt Yen Suqing at all. The next moment, Ning Ke should have died, but he didn't. With the momentum of dragging the pedao and chopping, he quietly loosened his left hand and very naturally reached to his back, grasping a hard object sticking out of the cloth. He grasped the handle of the big black umbrella. His slender and steady fingers grasped the handle of the umbrella and twisted it forcefully. The coarse cloth wrapped around the umbrella suddenly changed shape. The sturdy hard-woven cloth arched and tore in an instant, revealing a few patches of black inside. Those patches of black rotated and tore the cloth, like an ancient dragon that had been lying dormant for a long time, raising its head violently from the ground. More and more coarse cloth was torn apart, revealing more and more black. Gradually, the black patches formed a black umbrella surface. The surface of the black umbrella rotated and opened, and its surface area suddenly expanded. It was like a big black flower that was instantly stimulated by the condensed spring wind. With a bang, it covered Ning Ke's back and blocked the dark sword shadow that was buzzing and shrill. Yen Suqing mobilized all his psyche power to make a fatal sword shadow with endless power. However, when the hiltless small sword fiercely stabbed the seemingly ordinary and greasy umbrella surface of the big black umbrella, a very unimaginable follow-up change took place. There was no sound of the umbrella surface tearing, nor was there any sound of fierce collision. When the incomparably sharp flying sword pierced the surface of the black umbrella, it was like a fallen leaf falling into a boundless black swamp, or like a tired mosquito gently landing on the black signboard of the old workshop. The flying sword, vibrating and buzzing at high speed, seemed to be glued to the big black umbrella surface, and suddenly became absolutely quiet. A moment later, the fallen leaf falling into the boundless black swamp slowly sank without a trace, and the tired mosquito falling on the old black plaque dispiritedly and powerlessly fell to the air, falling to the end of its life. The previously agile and sharp hiltless small sword seemed to have lost all its life in an instant, falling from the big black umbrella surface and slowly falling to the ground. In the world of the chi of heaven and earth, a thread was broken. Yen Suqing's expression suddenly changed, finding that he could not sense his own natal sword. With a shrill roar, he released the coarse teacup with his left hand and put his palms together to clamp the blade of Ning Ke's one hand, chopping toward him. There was a hair's width between his palms and Ning Ke's blade, and they did not completely touch each other. However, in that extremely fine space, there seemed to be some kind of power filling it, as tight as cotton. The shrill roar reverberated in the quiet lakeside small house. Hearing the roar, the flying sword that had just fallen to the ground bounced for a while, but could not fly again no matter how hard it tried. It seemed to be extremely miserable and futile, like an old mosquito falling on the frosty ground in late autumn, with its thin wings frozen into glass ice. The so-called struggle was more like the twitching before death. Yan Suqing's eyes were full of killing intent. With another shrill roar, he crossed his palms to slap away the cold blade surface, and then his right hand came out of his sleeve. His body slanted and bounced up from the chair, and he used his fingers as a sword to stab Ning Kei's throat. At this time, the coarse and clumsy teacup fell to the ground heavily, and the ground was covered with black and red ceramic gravel. The hot water mixed with tea leaves scattered in a radial shape, and the white-hot air escaped in a panic. Yan Suqing used his fingers as a sword to stab Ning Kei's throat, and drew an arc slightly to the left, which was a little farther than the direct stab, which also gave Ning Kei the last time to react at the critical moment. He had to do so, because he wanted to avoid the big black umbrella behind Ning Quebec subconsciously. He did not want to touch the big black umbrella, even a little bit. The greasy and dirty surface of the opened big black umbrella looked darker and darker than the darkness before dawn in the lakeside small house. Yan Suqing did not know what the big black umbrella was. But as a sword master who had been immersed in the cultivation world for many years and had made progress in the past 10 years after he quit the military ministry and hid among the tea-scented clay pottery, he could vaguely feel the fear brought to him by the big black umbrella, which was the instinctive fear of cultivators. It was because of the deepest fear in his heart that Yan Suqing's finger sword was a little slower than usual. It was also in this extremely short time that Ning Kei had time to move the black umbrella to the left side of his body. At this time, the big black umbrella, which had been completely opened, had a large surface area. Like a big black flower floating on the lake, it obediently slid from Ning Kei's right shoulder to his left shoulder, and then covered his entire body. Yan Suqing's fingers poked on the surface of the big black umbrella fiercely. The feeling of poking on the surface of the black umbrella was a little slippery, sticky, and disgusting. Yan Suqing stared at the place where his fingertips touched the surface of the black umbrella. The deep fear in his heart surged out, his body trembled violently, and his face became extremely pale in an instant. He was extremely shocked to find that the psyche power in his body and the chi of heaven and earth mobilized by his psyche power were also surging out along with the inner fear. The big black umbrella was like the deepest and most boundless night, which would swallow all the light. Yan Suqing didn't expect that he would be forced into such a situation by an ordinary person and a seemingly ordinary big black umbrella. But he knew that he had been forced to the edge of the cliff of life and death. He didn't withdraw his finger sword, because as soon as the light entered the night, the winner must be decided. It was either day or night. Before or after sunrise and sunset, no one could leave in advance. A shrill and unpleasant howl burst out from his lips. The cultivator who had hidden among the people for more than 10 years finally broke out the most extreme strength. He exerted his psyche power at a terrifying speed and dispersed it around his body through the snow mountain and ocean of chi. He mobilized all the chi of heaven and earth that could be sensed in the lakeside small building, condensed it in front of his fingers, and turned it into sword style to stab the black umbrella. The overbearing and sharp sword power of the cultivator was transmitted from the surface of the big black umbrella to the handle, and then to Ning Kei's hand holding the handle. He lowered his head and stabilized the black umbrella with his left hand and shoulder blade. Listening to the cracking sound coming from his wrist bone and feeling the terrible power borne by his body, he clenched his teeth and didn't retreat. At this time, he was like a Tang soldier with the big black umbrella as a shield and a knife behind him, standing in the forefront of the decisive battle on the grassland, desperately resisting the violent attack of the barbarian tribes outside the shield. He couldn't retreat, for once he retreated, he would be defeated. Everyone from the frontier army of the Tang Empire had such a sense of discipline and courage. At this time, he concentrated all his spirit and strength on the handle of the umbrella to contend against Yan Suqing's finger sword, which was condensed with his lifelong cultivation. Besides, he faintly felt that something very precious in his body was constantly flowing away along the umbrella handle and into the surface of the big black umbrella. So he couldn't lift the pedal behind him with his right hand at all. With his finger on the umbrella and his body inside, the deadly stalemate lasted for a long time. The chi of heaven and earth surged in the lakeside small building and condensed in front of Yan Suqing's finger, turning into a very short and sharp sword intent that stabbed fiercely. Whether it was the dancing bamboo leaves or the gradually cooling water mist, they all seemed to feel the tense atmosphere in the field. Yan Qingsu snorted slightly, and the blue veins on his pale face appeared and then disappeared. The big black umbrella retreated a little. The umbrella handle slipped away from Ning Kei's left hand and hit his head hard. Finally, a trace of the extremely sharp sword style succeeded in penetrating the surface of the big black umbrella and pierced in from the point where the handle collided. With a puff, blood spurted out from Ning Kei's mouth and nose, spreading along the edge of the mask and dyeing his tender face red. On the other side of the black umbrella, Yan Suqing's eyes also began to drip blood, and the light in his eyes gradually dimmed. He had squeezed out too much psyche power and was almost exhausted. Now it all depended on who could hold on longer. The handle of the big black umbrella pressed on Ning Kei's chest like a mountain, and blood kept gushing out from his mouth and nose. The mask had been completely soaked with blood, and the blood kept dripping along the edge of the mask and onto his shoes. He raised his head with great difficulty, and his listless eyes brushed the edge of the black umbrella, looking at the tea master outside the umbrella. He found that Yan Suqing's thin cheeks had become even thinner at this time, and his eyes were deeply sunken. It seemed that he couldn't hold on much longer. All of a sudden, Ning Kei felt the power coming from the umbrella handle weakened a little. He suddenly raised his head, holding the umbrella handle tightly with his left hand, and pushing against the handle with his chest, he forced himself to take a step forward. The big black umbrella was like an indestructible big shield, pushing Yan Suqing back a step. A fierce howl of grassland beasts fighting brutally came out of the youth's mouth. He mobilized the last trace of strength in his body, lifted the padao dragged on the ground, and fiercely chopped at Yan Suqing. With a crack, the blade deeply penetrated into the depths of Yan Suqing's neck, and then continued to move forward with an extremely horrible sound of bones breaking and flesh breaking, until it came out from the other side. The pair of eyes on Yan Suqing's head stared at the teenager behind the black umbrella in disbelief. Then, his head tilted and fell from his neck, bounced twice on the ground, and rolled into the tea that was still giving off steam. The big black umbrella slowly fell down, and the umbrella handle was still tightly held in Ning Kei's hand. Ning Kei stared at the head on the ground, gasping rapidly, and said, "You're used to being a tea master, so you're no longer a sword master, because you even forgot to invite a valet." The darkness before dawn was so deep, and Chang'an was so quiet at this time. There were no pedestrians on the streets, not even a cat that was used to walking at night. A youth covered in blood ran out of a square in southern city. He staggered and ran, and sometimes his weak legs couldn't support him, so he fell heavily on the ground. Blood kept dripping from the edge of the mask. He felt that his sight was a little blurred, and even his mind was a little confused. He didn't know where he was, because of excessive blood loss or other reasons. "If I want to take your life, I will definitely take your life," he subconsciously murmured, looking for the way home. The voice came out of the mask that was soaked and stuck with blood, and seemed a little distorted. He had heard the siren before, and the remaining reason made him know that he had to leave here as soon as possible. The government had been alarmed, and if Chang'an City sent out the Yulin Royal Guards, he would only have a dead end. So he continued to run wildly on the Vermilion Bird Avenue that he didn't recognize. The black umbrella tied to his back was bounced up from time to time, and then opened, puff after puff. The vengeful youth covered in blood. The evil ghost that crawled back from the underworld. A black lotus grew on his back. "I've written for 10 hours, and I'm finally satisfied with writing to this point. F***CK. I'm not going to write a single chapter. By the way, I need everyone's recommendation and support on Monday. I didn't want to ask for monthly votes, but this chapter is so good that I feel sorry for myself if I don't take this opportunity to ask for monthly votes. Good night. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters after I wake up, and I'll make sure to write the best 3 chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 111. Ning Ke ran in the night and on the street. From time to time, he raised his right arm to wipe off the blood on his chin. The big black umbrella hit his back from time to time, making a cracking sound. As time went by, the luster in his eyes became dimmer and dimmer. His eyebrows that were exposed outside the mask became tighter and tighter, looking like he was in great pain. His vision became more and more blurred. In his eyes, the posts for tying horses and the archway at the entrance of the marketplace gradually became distorted and turned into monsters baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. His breathing became more and more rapid. The air that was squeezed out of his lungs was as hot as lava, but the air that he desperately inhaled was as cold as a glacier. His footsteps became more and more sluggish, and he often stumbled on the protruding bluestone slabs on the ground. His thoughts became more and more chaotic, and he gradually forgot his current situation. He only remembered that he should run, as far as possible. Some deep instinct urged him to run in the direction of the old brush pen shop on Lynn 47th Street. Perhaps only after seeing that dark and swarthy little girl would he feel safe and proper. This obsession to run home was so strong. It was so strong that it supported his seriously injured and weak body to run from South City to here. It was so strong that he didn't even notice that he was running on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, which usually made him the most vigilant and uneasy. The blood that dripped from the edge of the mask could be wiped off by his sleeves. The blood that oozed from the numerous sword wounds on his body slowly flowed to the big black umbrella. It was slowly absorbed by the sticky and greasy surface of the umbrella and then slowly released. It slowly dripped to the ground, and then a tiny blood flower bloomed on the ground and seeped into the cracks of the stones. Before dawn, there was a morning breeze, blowing the clothes that were drying under someone's eaves and making the dragon cloud flag that towered into the clouds in the distance on the Vermilion Bird Avenue flutter. The footsteps in the morning breeze and the faint smell of blood blended together, gradually awakening some life that had been hiding in the cracks of the stones for thousands of years. The spacious and straight Vermilion Bird Avenue in Chang and of the Tang Empire suddenly became a long and endless hellfire path. Ning Ke felt as if his feet were stepping on extremely hot red pebbles. Every step he took would burn through the soles of his shoes. Those bursting flames instantly spread and burned his flesh and bones. It was extremely painful. He was still running, taking one step after another. Every step he took was excruciating. With every step he took, he felt like his feet were being chopped into meat paste by countless knives. Suddenly, his body froze on the spot and he clutched his chest in pain. He felt as if an invisible spear had fallen from the night sky, piercing through his flesh, bones, and internal organs, penetrating his body and pinning him to the ground. The burning pain from the ground of Vermilion Bird Avenue instantly disappeared, because compared to the pain that came from his chest, that pain that seemed to want to tear everything apart and destroy everything, no pain in the world was worth mentioning. Ning Ke furrowed his brows painfully. He looked at his empty chest, the street that had been transformed into some kind of curved corridor, and Chang and city that had nothing to do with reality. He found that everything in his eyes had countless shadows, real and illusory, fake and deconstructed shadows, and he was standing between the real and illusory shadows of these things. Suddenly, he heard someone gasping softly beside his ear. Using the last of his strength, he turned his head and tightly grasped the hilt of the knife at his waist with his bloody hand. However, he did not see any trace of anyone, and he was still surrounded by those strange, deformed worlds. His face was as pale as a snow mountain. He looked around in confusion and subconsciously tried to find the source of the gasp. The stone posts that seemed to be about to fall to the ground were gasping, telling of the pain and annoyance of being tied by the neck every day. The yellow cloth of the wine shop in the market was gasping in the morning wind, telling of the unhappiness and uneasiness of being molested by drunkards every night. The locust tree that stretched out its waist in a house was gasping, telling of the fact that it had seen too many family secrets and was about to dry up. The green leaf that fell under the stone lion's seat was gasping, telling of the reason why it did not fall at the right time. The stone lion was gasping, the wooden building was gasping, the road under their feet was gasping, the morning wind was gasping, the distant imperial palace was gasping, the nearby gray wall was gasping, Chang'an was gasping, and the whole world was gasping. The delicate and charming gasps were like the moans of women, the long and continuous gasps were like the solemn gasps of the court, the anxious gasps were like the desperate gasps of a fugitive, and the indifferent gasps were like the ruthless gasps of history. Ning Ke listened to the gasps coming from all directions in the narrow streets, alleys, back gardens, and distant halls. He stood alone and helpless in the middle of the street. He loosened the hilt of the knife and covered his ears with both hands, but he still could not stop the various gasps from penetrating the back of his palms and clearly and powerfully entering his mind. He slowly knelt down in the middle of the dark Vermilion Bird Avenue and then fell down. The big black umbrella covered his back. The blood passed through the black umbrella, dripped on the bluestone, and flowed into the cracks of the stones. On the Vermilion Bird Avenue, which was paved with bluestone, there were countless tiny flowers made of tiny blood drops. From the South City all the way to the north, the blood flowers connected into a line, faintly connecting with the blood at the front of the black umbrella. The place where the blood line was pointing was the stone sculpture of the Vermilion Bird at the far end of the avenue. The Vermilion Bird engraved in the middle of the Imperial Road was deeply carved into the stone. It carried the history of the Tang Empire for more than 1,000 years. No one knew how many high-spirited new kings it had welcomed, and no one knew how many old heroes who ultimately failed to defeat time had been sent away. Its majestic eyes were always so calm and never moved for a moment. At this time, the eyes of the Vermilion Bird were still majestic as usual. However, the right wing of the three indescribably gorgeous top wings on top of its head slowly rose, as if it was going to break through the stone surface and enter the real world. Ning Ke fell unconscious under the big black umbrella. He had no idea that the Vermilion Bird in the distance had undergone such a strange change, nor did he know that a majestic and irresistible sense of destruction that seemed to come from ancient times had enveloped him. His blood flowed between the cracks of the stones, extremely shallow and flat, even shallower and flatter than what humans could imagine. It flowed from the middle of the avenue to the distance, flowing into the complicated and solemn feather stone crevices of the Vermilion Bird in the distance. Silently, the blood that flowed into the beautiful feather stone crevices of the Vermilion Bird Avenue quickly evaporated into a light red mist, and then was quickly purified by an invisible high-temperature power into an invisible void. The blood drops scattered on the bluestone slabs of the Vermilion Bird Avenue also began to evaporate and be purified, disappearing into nothingness one by one. The extremely shallow and flat blood between the stone crevices continued to evaporate and disappear at a speed visible to the naked eye, until finally it came under the big black umbrella and directly invaded Ning Ke's body along with the blood. The invisible scorching aura seemed to be able to incinerate everything in the world. The blood on Ning Ke's body quickly evaporated and disappeared without a trace, but his clothes did not change at all. His arms that were exposed outside his clothes and his cheeks that were exposed outside the mask began to quickly turn red, and the hair on his forehead quickly turned yellow and withered. His fingernails that rested on the bluestone began to become dry and crisp due to the rapid loss of water. A green leaf was blown up by the morning wind and fell on the back of his hand. Then it was brushed off again, still green and pleasing. An ant was disturbed by the fallen leaves and climbed up the back of his hand, and then climbed down from the other side, still alive. But if nothing unexpected happened, Ning Ke would be burned alive by the mysterious invisible flame released by the Vermilion Bird in the next moment. At this moment, a shadow descended and crushed the pitiful ant to death with a light smack. The big black umbrella, blown by the morning wind, gently covered Ning Ke's body, gently swaying like a black lotus. With the swaying of the black umbrella, the green leaf was instantly frozen into ice and scattered into countless tiny pieces of ice when the morning wind gently brushed it. An absolutely cold aura was gradually released from the black umbrella, slowly and unstoppably seeping into Ning Ke's hot body. After a moment, the redness on his cheeks and arms gradually faded and became snow white after a serious injury. The hair on his forehead quickly became black and glossy, and the fingernails on his hands that rested on the bluestone regained their luster. The vermilion bird on the stone street in the distance seemed to sense something. Its majestic and solemn eyes were obviously calm as usual, but it gave people a feeling that it was looking in the direction where Ning Ke was lying down. After a moment, the 3 indescribably gorgeous top wings on its head all rose up. Almost at the same time, the big black umbrella covering Ning Ke's body swayed even faster. The black wind was blowing in the black wilderness. The strong wind rolled up the black gravel and scattered it everywhere in the sky, so that it seemed that the light of the scorching sun in the sky had turned black. There was a black snow mountain in the distance of the wilderness, which was constantly melting and collapsing under the illumination of the black scorching sun. The melted snow water mixed with the black soil and gravel, reflecting the black sunlight and rushing around violently. The black snow mountain was about to collapse, and the flood it formed was about to destroy the whole world. But at this moment, the bright night suddenly came to the world, releasing an incomparably warm and cold aura. Ning Ke stood at a certain point in this space, looking at the magnificent scene of destruction in front of him with confusion and incomparable calmness. He did not know where this place was, but he knew that this was not a dream. This feeling was clear and firm, just as he clearly saw the light occupying most of the sky, but he was sure that it was night. The bright night covered most of the sky, blocking the blazing black sunlight and gradually slowing down the melting of the snow mountain. And the cold aura emitted from the bright night sky began to condense the raging flood in the black wilderness, turning it into dancing black ice and unwilling black snow. The whole world was reshaping, and the black snow mountain slowly and unstoppably stood up again. The world returned to peace, and the night returned to the color that night should have. The glaciers and snow rivers in the wilderness disappeared, as if nothing had changed, but also as if everything had changed. The sun in the sky warmly shone on the world, and the spring light melted the snow on the other side of the snow mountain. The gurgling water seeped into the depths of the snow, fell into the blue and dark underground ice cave, and then disappeared. After an unknown number of years, in a place far away from the snowy mountains in the wilderness, a pebble gently trembled and was pushed to the side. Then, a trickle of water gushed out and gradually spread out, flowing towards the horizon. On the bank of the river, there was a weak but strong blade of grass. Damn, this chapter seems to take 6 hours. I can only vomit blood and accept it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 112. The world disappeared, and Ning Ke woke up. He looked at the corpses of ants in front of him, which were scattered into a pile of green leaves and ice gravel. After a while, he struggled to get up. He didn't know how long he had been in a coma. It might be long or short, but he knew it was very dangerous to lie in the middle of the street. Listening to the faint sound of bamboo flute and horse hooves, he bit his lower lip hard, forced himself to cheer up, and ran into an alley on the side with his tired and wounded body. The blood on the bluestone street had disappeared without a trace. It was clean as if it had been washed by rain dozens of times and dried by the warm spring sun. He didn't notice where the blood on his body had gone. It was clean as if he had just taken a bath in the House of Red Sleeves for half a night. He only had a vague impression of what had happened when he was in a coma. He had no memory of the magical fight between the vermilion bird and the big black umbrella at the end of the street. Walking into the side alley, he quickly took off his outer shirt that was full of sword cuts. Only then did he notice that there was not a single trace of blood on his outer shirt. He was slightly startled and looked down at his body with difficulty. Indeed, there was not a single trace of blood. He could not help but have a strong suspicion in his heart. However, the situation was urgent and the government had been alerted. He had no time to think, so he directly tore off a piece of cloth and hung it on a branch. Then he threw the outer shirt into a house behind the wall. The pain in his chest was still unbearable. The invisible spear that came from the heavens seemed to still be stuck in his chest. Every step he took made his face paler. Even the slightest tremble made him feel like the tear in his heart was getting bigger. He stretched out his trembling hand and put it on a low wall. Then he jumped in with strength from his waist and abdomen. He quietly passed by a resident who was still sleeping in the cool morning. He took a cyan unlined shirt from a bamboo pole and quickly put it on. He had prepared the best medicine for wounds, but when he was putting on his clothes, he took a quick look and was surprised to find that the bloody wounds caused by the flying swords on the surface of his body had already healed. This kind of healing was not a true recovery. It looked more like someone had used fire to forcefully scorch his body. Only the bleeding had stopped, but the injuries were still there. Ning Ke made his way through the streets and alleys of the eastern city of Cheng, and in the last of the night. From time to time, he would hide behind trees and climb to the top of eaves to avoid the approaching hooves of horses and the sharper sounds of bamboo flutes. When he finally got close to Lin 47th Street, he found that he couldn't go back to the old brush pen shop to treat his wounds, because the yamen runners of the Cheng and local government with iron rulers and ropes had begun to knock on every door to inquire. Ning Ke frowned as he looked at those shop doors that had been knocked open. He raised his hand to cover his mouth and forcibly suppressed the strong urge to cough. He stepped back into the shadow of the alley and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. An ordinary-looking carriage appeared at the entrance of the alley, with the Academy's logo printed on the shaft. Ning Ke hid in the darkness and stared at the horse carriage that took him to the Academy every day. He listened carefully to the sounds of shops opening in the alley from time to time and silently counted the time in his heart. He kicked the wall with his tired right foot and exerted the last strength of his weak body. He rushed into the alley and opened the door of the carriage with his right hand as fast as lightning. The yamen runner who was questioning the owner of the old antique shop in the alley vaguely saw something out of the corner of his eye. He turned his head in astonishment and found that there was no one at the entrance of the alley except for a horse carriage quietly parked there. "Why is there a horse carriage parked here so early?" The yamen runner frowned and muttered to himself, ready to go and have a look. The owner of the antique shop, who was wearing a thin coat, yawned and glanced at the horse carriage at the entrance of the alley. He explained casually, "That's the horse carriage that takes Boss Ning to the Academy. It's waiting here every day at this time." Hearing the word Academy, the yamen runner stopped and laughed at himself. He turned around to look at the owner of the antique shop and said with emotion, "It's really rare that someone from our street can enter the Academy." In the horse carriage, Ning Ke watched the yamen runner and the owner of the antique shop talking at the stone steps. After confirming that there was no problem, he put down the curtain and gently knocked on the window lattice. He said in a tired voice, "Old Duan, we can go now." The coachman, Old Duan, was startled and turned around to look at Ning Ke behind the curtain. He said in surprise, "Boss Ning? When did you get on the carriage? Why didn't I know? You're up early today." "I didn't review the lesson plan of the etiquette department yesterday, so I'm in a hurry to go to the Academy to read it again," Ning Ke explained in a low voice. Then his expression changed slightly. He lowered his body and coughed violently, hurriedly covering his mouth with his sleeve. Listening to the suppressed but heart-wrenching coughing in the carriage, the coachman asked with concern, "Are you all right?" Ning Ke answered, "It was too hot last night. I gluttonous ate 2 bowls of ice and washed several buckets of well water. I think I caught a cold." The coachman turned around and held the reins with one hand and gently waved the whip with the other. He said with a smile, "Heat is the most troublesome. But you're young and vigorous. You'll be fine after drinking some cooling tea when you get back to the shop." Hearing the word vigorous, Ning Ke did not know why his heart palpitated. He was slightly startled and looked down at his sleeve. He found that it was stained with 2 smears of blood that he coughed up, so he gently held the corner of the sleeve in his hand. The southern city of Cheng was a noble place, and the lakeside house was even more noble. People who were qualified to live in such a place were either rich or noble. Although Yan Suqing, the tea master, was not allowed in the imperial court, he still had some fame in the upper circle of celebrities. The previous deadly fight in the lakeside house had already alarmed other lakeside residents. When they found that Yan Suqing, the tea master, was beheaded, the Chang and local government and even the Yulin royal guards immediately began a serious investigation. At this time, the city gate had just opened, which was a good time to block the murderer in the city. The local government runners of the Chang and local government inquired everywhere, the Yulin royal guards guarded the streets, and the inspection at the city gate was extremely strict. But no matter how strict the inspection was, there were still some differences. At least for the carriage with the logo of the academy, which was responsible for sending students to study in the academy, the solemn city gate guard just casually asked a few questions, and then lifted the curtain to take a look, and then waved his hand to let go. Ning Ke lifted the curtain and looked at the whole of the city gate, thinking that if the bloodstains on his body had not been completely annihilated, it would have been really difficult for him to pass today. At this time, he did not know that the bloodstains on the Vermilion Bird Avenue had also been completely evaporated and purified, leaving no trace. Otherwise, the cavalrymen of the Yulin Royal Guards would have already followed the bloodstains to catch up with him, who was exhausted and seriously injured. With the sound of hooves and wheels, the first ray of morning light fell on Chang and city, shining on the young boy's innocent cheeks, which made his pale face even paler. He could not help but squint his eyes, thinking of the black sunshine in that world and the many puzzling things that happened to him tonight. He subconsciously shook his head, and then hid the knife under the board of the carriage. When the carriage arrived at the academy, Ning Ke slowly and calmly walked into the academy. The stone path, which used to be lush with flowers and grass, seemed so long today, and every step was so painful. In order to not let others see his injuries and abnormalities, he had to endure no matter how severe the pain in his chest was, and could not even raise his eyebrows. Ning Ke could not attend classes in such a state. He knew that if he insisted on attending classes, it was very likely that he would spit out a mouthful of blood and die on the spot in front of the instructors and classmates. Therefore, he directly passed through the quiet side alley of the academy, and slowly walked across the wetland in the morning light, coming to the front of the old library. The old library was open to students day and night. It was still early at this time, and neither the instructors nor the 4 deacons were in. Ning Ke pushed the back of the building, and then slowly climbed upstairs with his right hand on the wall. When he arrived at the familiar second floor, Ning Ke was silent for a moment as he looked at the dense cultivation books on the bookshelves. Suddenly, he had a strong urge to read, because he had a very ominous feeling. This would be the last time in his life to go upstairs, and also the last chance to read these precious books. In the end, he did not take out the books from the bookshelves to read, nor did he have the energy to see if the guy named Chen Pippi had left a message. He wearily walked to the end of the bookshelves, walked to the floor under the west window, and sat down. Later, the female professor would come to copy her hairpin-style small regular script, right? If she saw him like this, how could he explain to her? Perhaps later he would close his eyes and never wake up again, so why bother to explain? Because of the excessive blood loss, and also because of the mysterious injuries and collisions inside his body, Ning Ke's thoughts were extremely chaotic. He was like those willow catkins floating in the spring wind, light as a feather, without any strength and direction. He looked down at his chest, feeling the feeling of emptiness and the unbearable tearing pain in the emptiness. Subconsciously, he raised his trembling right hand and slowly touched it. Ning Ke did not touch the spear from the sky, nor did he touch the blood, but he felt that his hand was full of sticky blood, and he was very sure that his chest was indeed pierced by the spear. An invisible big hole. Was he going to die inexplicably like this? Ning Ke thought painfully, and at the same time, he felt endless sleepiness in his mind. He felt that his eyelids had become as heavy as lead, and he kept trying to close them. He untied the big black umbrella behind him and gently put it beside him. Then, he wearily leaned against the wall behind him, slowly closed his eyes, and let out a relaxed sigh. His legs were naturally relaxed and opened. Just like that rainy day when Joyer sat under the gray wall. Soft footsteps came from the building, and the slender female professor slowly walked over. Seeing Ning Ke sitting under the wall, her eyebrows slowly furrowed, and her eyes fell on the big black umbrella beside the lad. The female professor looked at the big black umbrella and slightly frowned. When she looked at Ning Ke again, there was a trace of interest and inquiry on her tranquil face. What made the vermilion bird angry? Is it you, or this big black umbrella? She calmly looked at the lad on the verge of death. Somehow, she did not want to help him, but just sighed softly and regretfully said, "Speaking of which, I'm really curious. Why does a poor lad with no cultivation potential have so many secrets that even I can't see through?" "Because of the promise, I can't help you. Otherwise, I really want to see what you will become after you come back to life." The female professor's eyes were clear and beautiful, showing a kind of childish beauty that did not match her age. She looked at Ning Ke on the ground and said, "I will ask for leave for you, and hope that Haotian can give you luck and let you live. If you can't survive this time, don't blame me. Blame yourself for appearing 1 or 2 years too early." After a while, she brought a bowl of water and 2 steamed buns and put them beside him. Then, she returned to the desk by the east window and continued to write hairpin-style small regular script, as if she did not know that there was a dying lad not far behind her. Outside the window, the morning light gradually became brighter, and the cicadas chirped. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 113. Although the people of the Tang Empire were ferocious, Chang'an was the most benevolent city. Numerous imperial courts, government offices, and military camps were scattered in the city. High officials and nobles lived in the city, so the security was very good. Except for a few corpses in a duel of life and death, there were very few cases of abnormal deaths in Chang'an. Of course, the murder at the Spring Breeze Pavilion, which was approved by His Majesty in the palace, was not included. Therefore, when the murder happened at the lakeside in the southern city, the Chang'an local government suddenly became nervous in the morning. The new judicial military adjunct and the coroner squatted in the autopsy room and did not dare to go out. The head on duty led more than 100 government runners to run between the streets, sweating profusely. The current magistrate of Chang'an, Shengguan Yangyu, who had just gotten up, looked extremely gloomy. "Your Honor, the murderer must be an experienced killer. We searched around the murder scene but found no clues. We only found a piece of clothing in the side alley of the Vermilion Bird Avenue. I guess it was left by the murderer." The criminal official in charge of investigating major and important cases respectfully handed over the tattered coat and another piece of cloth in his hand, saying, "It's not that my subordinates are incompetent, the Yulin royal guards have also lost them." Shengguan Yangyu took the ragged coat and then looked at the piece of cloth against the morning light coming in from outside the hall. His triangular eyes shrunk so much that they almost turned into 2 soybeans, but he couldn't find anything. He said in a hoarse voice, "Ask the old man to check this coat. If he can't find any clues about the material, then focus on the needlework. This is a ready-made garment from the lawn embroidery workshop." Someone had knocked on the door and asked. This ready-made garment of this style and size was produced a few years ago and sold many pieces. This one is obviously old, so. The subordinate looked up at the expression on his honor's face and said carefully, "Neither the needlework or the material of the garment can be checked." Shengguan Yangyu gently stroked his sparse beard and said indifferently without any expression on his face, "The imperial court keeps us officials to do things. If it's not easy to check, shouldn't we?" After hesitating for a moment, the subordinate came forward and said in a low voice, "Sir, the coat left behind by the murderer has been cut countless times by the blade of the sword, but there is no trace of blood on it. According to this subordinate's judgment, there are only 2 possibilities." "Say it." Shengguan Yuyang said angrily, annoyed at his slowness. "The first possibility is that the murderer is wearing a very expensive soft armor, but look at the rips on the clothes, especially the places where the rips are. Even the best soft armor in the empire can't protect those places. The subordinate glanced at him again and lowered his voice even more. Then there is only the second possibility. This murderer is an expert at the peak of martial arts. Ordinary weapons or even flying swords can only cut open his outer clothes, but can't penetrate his protective yuan qi layer at all, so naturally there is no blood. Shangguan Yangyu's fingers that were stroking his beard suddenly froze when he heard the words, strong man at the peak of martial arts. He looked at his subordinate with cold eyes. A strong man of martial arts who could resist the flying sword of a sword master with only his protective primordial qi must be very fierce. There were not many such strong men in the whole empire. Nonsense. Shangguan Yangyu stared at his subordinate's eyes coldly and said coldly, the 4 generals with outstanding achievements are the strongest men at the peak of martial arts in the Tang Empire. Not to mention that the 4 generals are ordered by the emperor to guard the frontier all year round, even if they are now in Chang'an City. Do you think they will commit murder? The subordinate bowed again and again, indicating that he didn't mean that. If it is a strong man at the peak of martial arts from a foreign country, it is even more impossible. Shangguan Yangyu said with a gloomy face, once such people enter Chang'an City, the imperial court will closely monitor them. If they dare to do anything, aren't they afraid that the nation master will directly suppress them? This is impossible, that is impossible, then what is possible? The subordinate complained in his heart and raised his head to look at his honor expectantly, thinking that he had to show them a way. According to the regular procedure, the lakeside murder case will be archived first, and then you will investigate the case diligently and strive to solve the case as soon as possible. Shangguan Yangyu said slowly, and the hidden meaning in his words was very clear. The so-called strive to solve the case as soon as possible, the key was to strive. Even if you could not solve the case as soon as possible, as long as no one in the imperial court questioned you, no one would care. Looking at the subordinate who took the order and retreated, Shangguan Yangyu shook his head and took out a handkerchief from his sleeve to wipe the sweat on his face. His slightly red nose suddenly became redder because of the wipe. Hearing that the real murderer of the murder case was very likely to be a strong man at the peak of martial arts, the new prefectural magistrate of Chang'an City had the intention to retreat, because he knew that this matter must be very troublesome. As a senior official of the Tang Empire, although Shangguan Yangyu had a despicable temperament, he was not so weak that he could not even bear this responsibility. But he knew that if this murder case involved a lot of people, it was not a problem that could be solved by the Chang'an local government alone. If other departments did not take action, it meant that someone in the imperial court did not want to make trouble. His Majesty is very benevolent. He cupped his hands in front and bowed respectfully to the far north. His ugly face was full of gratitude. His Majesty has promoted me from the judicial military staff to the prefectural magistrate of Chang'an City. How dare I make trouble for His Majesty? There was an old tower made of yellow bricks in the southern city. The tower was badly damaged and entangled with green vines. It seemed that it would collapse at any time. However, after so many years, the old tower still stood among the small temples. It was silent and peaceful, watching others build tall buildings, and others build brothels. Every spring, countless wild geese returned from the south. Before the geese went to Xuanyang Lake in Gushan Commandery to spend the summer, they would fly over Chang'an City and circle around the old tower for many days. At that time, the shadows of the geese would cover the sky and the birds would sing. It was a spectacular scene. No one knew why these wild geese, who flew high in the sky and slept by the water, would appear in the bustling Chang'an City and be so interested in the old tower. But after a long time, they got used to it. In recent years, the scene of tens of thousands of flying geese had become another wonderful scene for the people of Chang'an to enjoy the spring. And the old tower also had a name, Wanyan Tower. Today, there was a monk living at the top of the Wanyan Tower, accompanied by the lamp and the Buddha statue in the shrine and the scriptures on the table. He rarely went down from the tower and rarely met the good Zen women in the back garden. This monk called himself Huang Yang, the younger brother of the Tang Empire's emperor. Today, he welcomed a guest who was equally distinguished. Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, looked at the monk who was copying scriptures at the table and said, "Last night, the vermilion bird woke up." Monk Huangyang replied calmly without raising his head, "The divine object left by the previous generation of sages has its own meaning. How can it be known to us ordinary people who are still trapped in the world of mortals? Brother Qingshan, why bother yourself? I have to finish a chapter. Otherwise, this writing method, with 3 chapters and each chapter is painstakingly written, will kill me. Besides, this chapter only has 2,000 words. That's because the last chapter yesterday had 4,000 words. So, I'm not cheating, right? Tonight, I'll try my best to finish it as soon as possible. I'll bow and spit out blood. The blood on your shoes. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Only a few people knew that he was a disciple of West Hill and that his sword formula came from Haotian Taoism. That's not the point. I'm not interested in denouncing the empire on behalf of the West Hill martial uncles. What I'm interested in is that the sword master tore the murderer's clothes before he died, but the murderer didn't bleed. Upon hearing this, Monk Huangyang seemed to be lost in thought and slowly replied, "An expert at the peak of martial arts?" Li Qingshan turned his head and tucked his sleeves behind him. He looked at the monk quietly and said, "It's impossible for the martial arts masters of the empire to make a move. The martial arts masters of the South Jin Kingdom, the Great River Kingdom, and the Yen Kingdom are all under the surveillance of the imperial court. Therefore, the possibility of this happening is very small. Therefore, I suspect that the ascetic monks of the Yueluan Kingdom have snuck in and gone crazy. That's why you came to ask me." Monk Huangyang smiled and repeated what he had said before. "It's said in the world that you have been to the unknown place in the wilderness. I know it's not a legend, but a true story. In that case, I certainly have to ask you about the ascetic monks of the Yueluan Kingdom. I'm from the Pingzhou prefecture of the Tang Empire." Monk Huangyang stopped smiling and replied quietly, "And I don't believe that the monks of the Yueluan Kingdom would take the risk of sneaking into Chang'an City to kill people for no reason. Then how do you explain the bloodless clothes on the murderer's clothes?" Li Qingshan looked into his eyes and asked. Monk Huangyang's eyes were peaceful and he replied slowly, "The vermilion bird wakes up due to anger and condenses the breath of heaven and earth into the nameless fire. The fire is powerful enough to burn everything, let alone some sticky blood stains. Maybe the murderer has already been burned to ashes." This younger brother of the emperor of the Tang Empire, a monk who had advanced in Dharma, was really amazing. He had actually guessed the truth of the matter so easily. However, this couldn't completely explain all the problems. Li Qingshan frowned and asked, "Even if you and I do our best, we can probably only make the painting lazily open its eyes to take a look. How many people in the world can believe that the vermilion bird wakes up and gets angry? If he really is one of those legendary predecessors, why did he come to Chang'an City to kill people? Why did he take the risk of provoking the vermilion bird's anger? Why didn't he show any signs?" Monk Huangyang smiled and said, "Again, the divine objects left by the previous sages have their own meanings in their movements. How can we ordinary people understand them? If the predecessor who may have come to Chang'an City has really surpassed the knowing destiny state and has the ability of Tianqi or the limitless thought, then his purpose is not something we can guess." Sages, divine objects, Tianqi, limitless. These words echoed in the cramped space at the top of the Wanyan Tower. Even the master of Tang Empire and the exquisite Buddha could not help but fall into a long silence in the face of these extraordinary existences. The 13th year of Tianqi is really not peaceful. Li Qingshan sighed softly and turned to look at the sky outside the glass window, which was confined to the size of several palms, the floating clouds in the sky, and the noisy birds on the clouds. He said leisurely, "Nothing serious, but there are always some small things that make people uneasy. I am thinking whether I should make a divination or not. Buddhist disciples practice Zen, not life. Monk Huangyang looked at his back and said calmly, I have never believed in the Han divination. Please don't forget how much trouble the imperial astronomer caused when he observed the stars. Now it seems that the judgment of the night covers the stars and the country will be restless is really absurd. Li Qingshan gazed at the clouds behind his back and said indifferently, the clouds have a mind, and the stars have a mind. Any deduction of fate that seems absurd and nonsensical right now will be discovered in the end when fate reaches the next juncture. It's not that the deduction is absurd and nonsensical, but that fate has always been very easy to become absurd and nonsensical. Even if what you said is right, don't forget the comments made by the divine priest from West Hill when he taught you Taoism. Even if you have the ability to see the sky, you have to pay for it with your life. When the imperial astronomer's stargazing caused countless disturbances, the empress begged you to do a divination in order to cleanse herself, but you refused. Are you going to shorten your lifespan today because of a slight emotion in your heart and an inexplicable feeling? The mysteries of heaven are unpredictable. I, Li Qingshan, still want to see the prosperity of the Tang Empire for a few more years. How can I shorten my life painstakingly? Li Qingshan slowly frowned and looked at the bustling peddlers under the tower and outside the temple shouting against the heat. He said, but even at the risk of being seriously ill, I also want to see what kind of variable has fallen on this chessboard. Monk Huangyang sighed softly in his heart and no longer tried to stop him. He moved away the Buddhist scriptures, brush and ink on the table, took out the black and white chess pieces in a chessboard from the box, and put them on the desk. Li Qingshan turned around and walked to the desk. He did not make any complicated and mysterious movements, but just flicked his sleeves, grabbed 2 black and white chess pieces, and threw them on the chessboard casually. Dozens of matte chess pieces hit, rolled and rotated on the wooden chessboard, making a crisp sound. After a long time, they gradually calmed down. Following the will of fate, they silently fell in their positions and did not move anymore. Li Qingshan and Monk Huangyang's eyes fell on a black chess piece on the chessboard at the same time. This chess piece did not move in a straight line, nor did it control the Tianyuan, nor was it confined to a square. It just fell in a slanted position, randomly and weirdly. The vertical and horizontal lines on the chessboard were like the narrow roads in the human world. The chess pieces were like the carriages of travelers, stopping at the crossroads and asking each other questions. They were either friends or enemies, or they would not meet again after drinking 2 cups of tea. It was peaceful as usual, and the disputes were as usual. Only one carriage stood in the middle of a broad road, neither moving forward nor backward, neither exchanging greetings with the travelers on the side of the road, nor trying to break through everything. It just stood there in silence, blocking the road. It was this block that suddenly made the crisscrossing and intersecting narrow road strange. People going south could not go south, and people going west could not go west. Enemies who wanted to draw their swords and fight each other could not see each other through it. Lovers who wanted to love each other could not hug each other through it. The piece became stiff, and the disputes became chaotic. Is this the variable on the chessboard? Looking at the black chess piece and the silent carriage in the crisscrossing narrow roads, Li Qingshan, the nation master of Tang, still looked calm, but his face turned pale at a speed visible to the naked eye, as if he was suffering from a serious illness at this moment. There was a dead silence at the top of Wanyan Tower. No one knew how long the silence lasted, but it was finally broken by Li Qingshan's hoarse and tired voice. His voice was empty, without any emotion of sadness or joy. This variable is going to die. Monk Huangyang heard this and was slightly stunned. Looking at the black chess piece, he slowly put his palms together and showed mercy. At this moment, Li Qingshan raised his eyebrows and a strange color flashed in his eyes. He said, "No, there is another variable." The night came, but the heat had not subsided. The cicadas were still singing outside the window. It was quiet on the 2nd floor of the old library of the academy. No one knew when the delicate female professor by the east window had left. Under the west window, the seriously injured teenager was still sitting against the wall. His face was pale and his eyes were closed, as if he would fall into an eternal dark sweet dream in the next moment. Not far away, there was a row of bookshelves against the wall. The complex decorations on the side of the bookshelves shone slightly and then slid away silently. A moment later, a fat teenager in the summer robe of the academy squeezed in, panting. Just as he was about to squat down with difficulty and pull out the book Wu Zhanyang's Theory on Haoran's Sword from under the bookshelf, the fat teenager suddenly frowned. A trace of suspicion appeared on Akiji's white and tender face. He turned around and looked. Looking at the teenager who was motionless against the wall not far away as if he was asleep, his knitted eyebrows gradually relaxed. He smacked his thick lips and sighed. When did the academy have a guy who is more desperate than Ninkei? Finally, it's earlier than 2 days ago. I'll try to finish the second chapter before 2:00. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for it and vote monthly. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 115. Ninkei did not believe that he would die because of the law of cause and effect that he firmly believed in. However, he was seriously injured today and the invisible spear pierced through his chest was beyond his cognition. Therefore, on the 16th year since he came to this world, he finally began to seriously consider the issue of death. He woke up and tried to open his eyes immediately. He raised his head and looked around with the last of his strength, trying to see if he had come to the underworld and if the underworld really existed in this world. A very white and round face appeared in the air very close to him. The eyes on the round face were narrowed into 2 small dots, which were staring at him with puzzled and curious eyes. Because this big face was round, white, smooth, and tender, it looked like the moon in his hometown that he had not seen for a long time. Therefore, Ninkei, who had been attacked by his injuries and lost his mind, did not feel afraid. Instead, he felt very close to it. He leaned against the wall and slightly tilted his head to look at the big round face near him. He smiled weakly and said, "The Yiksha in the underworld should be very dark, so I should not be dead yet." "Then, who are you?" The big round face near him did not scare Chinpipi, but he suddenly opened his eyes and startled Chinpipi. Chinpipi widened his eyes and stared at the pale face of the man. He said, "I want to know who you are." Ninkei raised his trembling right hand to cover his seemingly normal but actually painful and empty chest. He frowned and looked to the side to make sure that he was still on the second floor of the old library. It was already dark outside the window, and the female professor by the window had left. He could not help but feel surprised and cold. Why did the female professor turn a blind eye to him? Now, except for himself, basically no student of the academy would go to the second floor of the old library, not to mention that it was late at night. Thinking of the handwriting that was obviously left at night, he was stunned and looked at the fat lad in the summer robe in front of him. He asked in a hoarse voice, "Chinpipi?" Chinpipi's eyes widened. Of course, no matter how big it became, it was just the process of changing from a mung bean to a green bean and then to a soybean. He stared at Ninkei and said incredulously, "You are Ninkei?" "That's right." Ninkei stared at his round face, and a flame of intense shock suddenly appeared in his eyes. He said in a hoarse voice, "If you don't want to see me die, think of a way to save me." Chinpipi didn't ask why he had to save her. These days, the two of them had been exchanging letters. Although they hadn't met face to face, they already knew each other's temperament. What's more, the idiots scolded each other, mocked and ridiculed each other. After helping each other so many times, how could they just watch each other die without helping each other? Putting 2 fingers on Ninkei's wrist, Chinpipi was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and stared at Ninkei's eyes in disbelief. He said, "How come you're still alive after such a serious injury?" "Not dying doesn't mean I won't die. I'm about to die." "How much more nonsense do you want to spout, you idiot?" "You idiot, why didn't you get treated in Cheng, and when you were so badly injured?" Why did you come to the academy and dawdle? Don't tell me you came all the way here just to treat my injuries? Why not? Didn't you say you were a genius? What does genius have to do with medical skills? The first question you gave me was a prescription. Prescriptions can't cure people. You should be dead now. No matter how exquisite the prescription is, it can't cure you. Ning Kei's spirit was extremely weak. Looking at the guy in front of him, he said, I've been lying here for a whole day, but no one in the academy cared about me. Even the gentle and pleasant female professor left me here so heartlessly. You can't leave me alone. Chen Pippi looked down and saw the bowl of water and 2 steamed buns beside Ning Quebec. He said, Senior sister is quiet and peaceful. She lives in the cottage at the back of the mountain and is always quiet. She didn't leave you alone, you don't have to explain anything. The academy must reject indifference and warm you and me. Ning Kei tiredly raised his head and looked at Chen Pippi under the dim starlight. After a moment of silence, he smiled self-mockingly and said, Anyway, my life is in your hands. After saying this, his eyes slightly drooped and his shoulders loosened. He quickly fell into a coma again. Chen Pippi opened his mouth wide and looked at the guy in a coma in the corner, his face full of disbelief. What is this? You fainted without saying your last words. Are you bullying me because I have to save you? You're acting shamelessly. How can you do things like this? He muttered angrily and squatted down with difficulty. Finally, he simply sat on the floor and stretched out his right hand. His 5 fat fingers tapped on Ning Kei's chest dozens of times like lightning. When he checked Ning Kei's pulse, he knew that Ning Kei was seriously injured, and the injury was between the ocean of qi and mountain of snow in his chest. For an ordinary person or even an ordinary cultivator, this kind of injury was indeed fatal. But as Ning Kei hoped, as a peerless genius cultivated by both the West Hill and the Academy, Chen Pippi was really a peerless genius even though he did not look like one. The most important temperament of a genius was self-confidence. As for the pride extended from self-confidence, it was another matter. Chen Pippi's self-confidence was all round. Since Ning Kei was not dead at this time, he firmly believed that Ning Kei would be fine as long as he took action. Is the fatal injury in the ocean of qi and mountain of snow so terrible? I, a genius, can easily use the natural stream magical finger and the Academy's no-boundary spirit to gather the pure qi of heaven and earth. I only need a few seconds to lift you up. Chen Pippi suddenly let out a strange cry and withdrew his fingers as if touching charcoal. His eyes fell on Ning Kei's chest, which did not show any abnormality. He frowned as if his eyebrows were about to be folded into several sections, and his expression became unprecedentedly serious. It's so weird, so weird, so weird, how could it be possible? His thick lips slightly moved. Chen Pippi stared at Ning Kei's chest and kept murmuring to himself. No one knew what he had found, but his voice became more and more trembling and less confident. There is a sharp sword style entering your body through the wood and breaking your internal organs and flesh. It should be a cultivator who hurt you. But that cultivator is at most in the see-through state. How could the sword style staying in your flesh resist my natural stream finger? Why doesn't the gentleman's no-boundary spirit that teacher taught me work at all? This sword style is indeed sharp, and it is the cultivator's desperate strike before his death. Ning Kei, you poor guy who can't cultivate, actually forced a sword master to this point. You are really proud. But, if I can't cure you, how can I be proud in front of you in the future? No. Where does the cold aura around your chest and abdomen come from? How can it touch my Taoist heart? No. How can there be such a scorching aura? Where does this destructive aura come from? Chen Pippi was shocked and fell on the floor. He looked at Ning Kei, who was leaning against the wall and unconscious. He thought to himself, what on earth happened to you? How could there be such a strange and terrible phenomenon in your body? He gradually hid the shock on his face and put his hands on his knees. He slowly closed his eyes and began to think about what he had detected before. Occasionally, he raised his round hands and gently drew some unknown emblematic gestures in the air in front of him. He carefully continued to investigate the movement in Ning Kei's body. After a long time, Chen Pipi opened his eyes and looked at Ning Quebec. The emotions in his eyes had long been unable to calm down, only endless puzzlement and confusion. According to his judgment, there should be a copious and irresistible scorching power that directly entered Ning Kei's body through the channel that cultivator used his sword style to break in Ning Kei's chest, and instantly destroyed the stupid snow mountain that was blocked by all acupoints. Logically speaking, when the snow mountain under the ocean of Qi was directly destroyed, Ning Kei should have died immediately. But somehow, there was an absolutely cold aura that entered this guy's body, and when the snow mountain collapsed and melted, another snow mountain was formed. It had to be admitted that in the cultivation world, Chen Pipi was indeed a peerless genius that only appeared in 100 years. He did not witness the battle in the lakeside house, did not see the raised top wing on the Vermilion Bird Avenue, did not see the invisible spear thrown from the sky, and did not see the big black umbrella gently swaying like a lotus. He also did not use divination like the nation master Li Qingshan did. He only deduced the situation at that time through Ning Kei's internal injuries. However, knowing how Ning Kei's internal injuries were formed did not mean that he could cure them. After the snow mountain in his body was destroyed, he did not die on the spot, and in the blink of an eye, a new snow mountain was formed. What a mysterious and profound method. I'm afraid the great god's vanquished skill in the Taoist temple is no better than this. Haotian's brilliance enlightens mortals' apertures, which is probably the way of destruction and rebirth. Chen Pipi stared at the unconscious Ning Kei absent-mindedly, and murmured in a trembling voice, "But I didn't feel a trace of Haotian's divine light in this guy's body, and how could those great divine priests of West Hill come to Chang'an? Even if they suddenly became idiots, how could they exhaust half of their lifetime cultivation to enlighten you? If it was not the great god's vanquished skill, then who did something in your body? Was it someone from Xiankong Temple? No, those bald monks only know how to chant and preach Zen, but they don't have this kind of earthly method. Those stupid guys from Devil's Doctrine can't do it, and the master in the Taoist temple can't do it either. Such a wonderful method. I don't know if the headmaster of academy can do it, but the master is traveling with eldest brother in other countries, and there is no reason for him to come back at this time. What the hell is going on?" Chen Pipi was puzzled, and scratched his head in pain. His black hair kept passing between his fat fingers, like a tired old bull painfully plowing the black soil of Yen Kingdom. Chen Pipi was very clear that the destruction and reconstruction of the snow mountain in Ning Kei's body seemed to be a great lucky chance, but without the protection of Haotian's divine light, this extremely violent destruction and rebirth was basically equal to death. The snow mountain in Ning Kei's chest and abdomen was extremely unstable, and could collapse at any time, and the aura there was so weak that it was close to nothingness. If this guy wanted to survive, someone had to inject vitality into him with a very mysterious method. The primordial qi between heaven and earth was balanced, so how could he find vitality in the nothingness of the night? Unless he could find the exotic flowers and fruits on the foreign islands that had been nourished by the primordial qi for tens of thousands of years, there was only a glimmer of hope for the dying Ning Quebec. But where could he find those exotic flowers and fruits nourished by the primordial qi of heaven and earth? Not in the academy, not in Chang'an, not in the whole Tang Empire, not even Chen Pipi. Chen Pipi looked at the unconscious Ning Kei for a long time, and then lowered his head to take out a crystal-clear porcelain bottle made of unknown materials. His face showed a painful and hesitant expression, and his arm holding the small porcelain bottle began to tremble, as if the small porcelain bottle was as heavy as a peach mountain and could not bear it. Chapter 3, Try to finish before 4:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 116. People looked up at the high sky and praised Haotian's kindness. No matter how diligent they were in cultivation, no matter how perceptive they were, they never dared to dream of flying into the sky. Because they knew that no matter how difficult the road was, it was not as difficult as reaching the sky. The road from the mortal world to the sky was always full of difficulties and obstacles, and no one had ever succeeded. Haotian Divine Hall was in West Hill, and claimed to be the only sect of light that could understand the will of Haotian. But no one had ever heard of a great divine priest who could become a part of Haotian's brilliance. There was a kind of elixir in West Hill called the Heavenly Power Pill. Just from the name, one could tell how precious this kind of elixir was. It was hidden in an unknown place and was extremely rare. At this time, there were 2 heavenly power pills in the porcelain bottle in Chen Pippi's trembling hand. They say that I'm a cultivation genius in 100 years, and I was given 3 heavenly power pills after I joined the sect. As a result, the old Taoists deep in the temple held a meeting for 3 days. You know, senior brother Yi only ate 1 back then. I ate 1 and kept 1 to save my life. I wanted to save the last one for senior brother in the future, but I just gave it to you. Although the heavenly power pill can't help people reach the heavenly power realm, it can increase one's lifespan by at least 10 years if it is given to an ordinary person. If it is given to a cultivator, they may be able to cross the heavenly power realm directly. If the pill is given to the monarch of the Great River Kingdom, it can definitely be exchanged for 30,000 docile virgins. It's not difficult for him to give up the throne to me. If I give this pill to Tang Ham of the Devil's Doctrine, he may be willing to betray his sect and join West Hill. Such a precious heavenly power pill is given to a poor guy like you to treat his injury? Chen Pippi wouldn't care if it was an ordinary treasure, or even if he had to use his psyche power to save the dying Ning Quebec. But the 2 pills in the bottle were too important. They were the most precious elixirs of Haotian Taoism in West Hill. If they were spread to the world, it would cause a lot of turmoil, so he was very hesitant. After a long time, the fat lad sighed bitterly and looked at the unconscious Ning Quebec. He said weakly, "Those monks always say that saving a life is more important than building a 7-story stone tower. Although I don't know what's so important about those ugly stone towers, I think it makes sense. Although I still think your life is not as important as this pill, the heavenly power pill can't speak, and you have entrusted your life to me shamelessly before you passed out, you?" The so-called reason was actually just an excuse to convince himself. Chen Pippi showed a sorrowful expression. He unscrewed the cap of the sparkling and translucent porcelain bottle and carefully poured a pill into his palm. Then he sent it to Ning Kei's mouth. The color of the pill was like rice dumpling, without any luster or smell. It didn't attract the singing of hundreds of birds in the night sky. It just gave off a faint herbal smell and seemed very ordinary. If you had died earlier, this heavenly power pill could have been saved. If you hadn't come to the academy, this heavenly power pill could have been saved. If you hadn't left your message on the paper when you had no way to cultivate, I wouldn't have known you. Then this heavenly power pill could have been saved. Chen Pippi stuffed the pill into Ning Kei's mouth, picked up the bowl of water beside him and poured it into Ning Kei's mouth. He pressed his palm on Ning Kei's chest to help him dissolve the pill. He murmured and complained, his face full of sorrow and regret. "You're so smart, so persistent, and so smart. But your acupoints in the ocean of qi and mountain of snow are blocked. You're so pitiful. It's not an exaggeration to say that you're a lad cursed by Haotian." Ning Kei's eyes were still tightly closed, but his pale cheeks quickly became rosy. Chen Pippi stared at him and lamented, "Now that your snow mountain has been destroyed and rebuilt, you might be able to unblock some of your acupoints. But you got a serious injury that can't be cured without the heavenly power pill, and you met me, the only person in the world who has the heavenly power pill. But I couldn't bear to see you die. So you are actually a young man who is favored by Haotian." The melted and collapsed snow mountain was instantly rebuilt by the cold power. It seemed magical, but the structure of the snow mountain was extremely unstable and could collapse again at any time. The dangerous glaciers inside were full of holes. Most of the holes could not connect the front and back, but made the snow mountain as fragile as a wooden pillar that had been eaten by termites. The precious heavenly power pill was melted by the water and slowly penetrated down through Ning Kei's throat. Before it reached his stomach, it turned into a faint medicinal power and dissipated among his internal organs like a faint starry divine light. Under the illumination of the divine light, the snow mountain in the distance did not collapse again. A corner rose abruptly and stood quietly under the firmament, as noble as a saintess and as firm as a warrior. It slowly melted and moistened the dry wilderness under its feet. A breath of life pervaded that strange space. This breath did not come from the sun above the firmament, but from the origin of the world. Day and night alternated, and the trickling ice stream flowed slowly. Gradually, a second blade of grass grew by the stream and then spread into a grassland. There were herds of gazelles jumping happily among the grass, and voles chewing the grass roots happily under the ground. Several green trees grew in the depths of the grassland, which made people very happy. The heavenly power pill dissipated very slowly, but was absorbed very quickly by the human body. When the last trace of medicinal power melted into Ning Kei's ocean of qi and mountain of snow, he woke up. At this time, the morning light had risen outside the old library. He leaned against the wall tiredly, squinting at the morning light coming in from the east window. His dry lips moved slightly, and he murmured so softly that it was almost inaudible, "Everything has its cause and effect. Master Haotian, you naturally have your reasons for bringing me to this world. I knew you wouldn't just watch me die. It's not Master Haotian. It's me, the genius, who can't watch you die." Chen Pipi leaned against the wall beside him and rubbed his dry eyes. He muttered, "You're all guys who have one foot in the underworld. When you wake up, you don't even know who you should thank." Ning Kei smiled tiredly and looked at his big round face quietly. He really didn't expect that Chen Pipi, who had left a message for a long time, would look like this. He asked, "How did you cure this injury?" Chen Pipi moved his fat body, rubbed his back against the wall, and stood up with difficulty. Then he put his hands on his waist and moved his sore body. He smiled contemptuously and waved his hand, saying, "How many times have I said that I'm a rare genius in the world? If you were treated by ordinary doctors, you would definitely lie in a coffin. But for me, it's just a small matter of waving my sleeves." The fat lad had always thought that he was a peerless genius in 100 years. Therefore, he had been demanding himself with the demeanor of a genius since he was a child. He envied the demeanor of his senior brothers, who were most particular about being calm. Last night, in order to cure Ning Kei, he had given him a rare and precious pill. But since he had given it, it would be a bit like showing kindness to others if he kept emphasizing it, which was seriously not in line with his aesthetic taste. Therefore, he didn't explain the details and just waved his sleeves, showing that he didn't care. Of course, if someone stood in front of him at this moment, he would definitely see that the fat on his round face was slightly twitching because of the pain and regret in his heart. In the morning light, the pained Chen Pipi turned around with a calm expression. He looked at Ning Kei's eyes and suddenly made a request, "Can I see the big black umbrella beside you?" Ning Kei was startled. After a moment of silence, he looked up at the lad and said, "I don't have the strength. You take it yourself." So it was Chen Pipi's turn to be startled. He frowned and looked at Ning Kei for a long time. After a long silence, he struggled to get down and held the handle of the big black umbrella. It was a little cold in his hand. The handle of the umbrella should be made of some common wood in the northern part of the empire. The black umbrella looked a little greasy, but nothing else could be seen. Chen Pipi looked at the big black umbrella in his hand for a long time and didn't see anything wrong. After a moment of silence, he put the umbrella back to Ning Kei and said, "Last night, I took the time to inquire about something." "What?" Ning Kei asked tiredly. "The vermilion bird woke up yesterday." Chen Pipi stared at his eyes. Ning Kei frowned slightly and thought of how he felt when he was seriously injured and unconscious on the long street. He thought of the palpitation he felt when he and Sang Sang walked through the Vermilion Bird Avenue with the big black umbrella a few months ago. But he really didn't know that the vermilion bird in the distance had been awakened at that time, so he just shook his head. Chin Pippi didn't see anything wrong. After a short pause, he continued, yesterday, a sword master died in Chang'an. Ning Ke was silent. Chin Pippi looked at him with a faint smile and said, there are many sword wounds on your body. Although they have stopped bleeding, they are not old wounds because of the fire. Ning Ke smiled and looked up to ask, what on earth do you want to say? You were seriously injured, but you didn't go home to lie down. Instead, you came to the academy in a horse carriage. It can only mean that you were injured in the morning. At that time, the Chang'an local government was searching for you. You couldn't go home, so you had to come to the academy to hide. The Chang'an local government wouldn't stop the academy's horse carriage, let alone search for you in the academy. Yesterday morning, the sword master died and the vermilion bird on the long street woke up. You were injured so many times, but there was no blood on your body. All the wounds were burned by the invisible fire. That can only mean one thing. Chin Pippi looked at him and said with a frown, the person who killed that swordsman was you, and the person who caused the vermilion bird to be so infuriated is also you. But what I still cannot understand is that the person who did all these things is just an ordinary person. I admire you. If your surname can be Fu, then my surname can be Hua. Ning Ke leaned against the wall tiredly and said, the problem is that since you saved me after so much trouble, I believe you won't give me to the government. So why do you ask me these questions? Chin Pippi raised his eyebrows and said proudly, because I, the genius, want to prove to you that nothing can be hidden from me. Ning Ke looked at him with a smile and suddenly said, there is no big family in West Hill that has influence all over the secular world as you said in your message. There is only one place that is afraid of the academy, and that is Haotian Divine Hall. You are not the heir of a family, but the heir chosen by Haotian Taoism. I don't know if your master was the hierarch of Haotian Taoism or which great divine priest. But I still can't understand why the Haotian Divine Hall of West Hill, the heir chosen by the academy, and the peerless genius who has been accepted by the academy, is so fat. Finish the fight. Sleep. I have to get up early tomorrow. The washstand in the house was completely cracked. It's leaking. I need to find someone to fix it. I'm as angry as Chin Pippi. My pride is hurt. Because I bought it. It's just over the warranty period. And it's very expensive. I don't understand why it's like this. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.